Hey there, welcome to Bedtime Chills. Tonight, dive into 4 hours of gripping horror stories, all set to the soothing sounds of rain and soft thunder. These chilling tales will keep you on edge while helping you wind down for sleep. If you enjoy the eerie calm, drop a like and let me know when and where you're listening in the comments. Now, dim the lights, get cozy, and let's step into the darkness together. My hometown had very strict security measures. I was born in a small town in Eastern Europe. I won't tell you its name or which country it's in. I believe it is better if it remains free of tourists. Suffice it to say, it was no place special. It wasn't small enough that everyone knew each other by name, but it was small enough that you'd know most people's faces. It had a mall, a movie theater, nice schools, interesting architecture, more churches than we ever needed, and the biggest point of pride for the locals was our almost zero crime rate. At worst, some teens would vandalize an old building, but other than that, it was the safest town in the country. If you ever went there, you might attribute that to the extreme measures people took to ensure their houses could not be broken into. Although, you'd only see that if you happened to visit on the last day of the month. I remember the routine very well. We repeated it every month of my life, always on the last day. My mother would kiss my father as he left for work and sternly warn him to come back before sunset. My father always promised that he would. He never broke that promise. We never had school that day, and most parents, including my mother, didn't allow their children to play outside. Kids and rebellious teenagers were kept indoors all day, along with pets. I later discovered it wasn't always this way, but you know how children are. They start playing with their friends, lose track of time, and when sunset comes around, they still haven't made it home. It was safer to keep them from leaving home at all. When my father came home, he and my mother would immediately begin locking up. My grandparents always came to spend the night with us. I would sit in the living room with them and watch as my parents went about their careful procedure. My father would carefully lock each and every door and window in the house. My mother would follow him, double-checking each lock and crossing them off a list she carried. When they were done, they would make another sweep of the house, my father triple-checking the locks, and my mother pulling down the blinds and closing the curtains. Then they would place a steel plate over the fireplace, screwing it in with practiced ease, and do the same to the front and back doors. In the morning, they were removed and put back in the attic. The nights were most awful during winter. Not being able to light up the fireplace meant that the only way to keep warm was to bundle up in blankets, which never felt like they were enough, even with 6 of them piled on top of us. After the locking ceremony, we gather in the living room, closing that door also, and wait out the night. We could talk, but not very loudly. No one usually felt like talking, anyway. We could sleep, but it was rare that anyone actually felt relaxed enough to even try. We always opened the sofa bed, though, to spare my grandparents' backs if they wanted to. They never did. We were all too tense, jumping at every slight noise. If the furniture made a cracking sound, we'd almost have a collective heart attack. A sneeze could induce a panic attack. We kept 2 oil lamps burning, not because we needed the extra light, but so we wouldn't be left in darkness should one go out for some reason. We had a 3rd lamp to be lit should anyone need to go to the bathroom. If so, they never went alone. You had to take 2 people with you. When I needed to go, my father and grandfather would take me. The bathroom door was kept open while we were in there, and we weren't allowed to flush, no matter what we had done. Whoever accompanied you took my father's shotgun on the trip. Those who stayed in the living room kept the hunting rifle ready to fire until the others returned. I hated my body on those nights, hated it and its need to piss and shit. I would try to keep it in for as long as I could because nothing scared me more than having to cross a dark house with an armed man at my back and another holding a lamp that cast the most horrible shadows. We weren't allowed to simply turn on the lights. No lights. No sound. Nothing that might call their attention. It was harder for people with babies and small children. They don't really understand the gravity of the situation. They cry loudly and throw tantrums. More babies were buried in my town than any other, accidentally smothered by their mothers desperately trying to quiet them. There was never an arrest or even an investigation. Everyone understood the terror that had driven them to that. Most nights were quiet. I would distract myself by playing cards alone or straining my eyes to read. Sometimes, I could get bored enough to forget I was terrified. But there were noisy nights. Nights when they roamed very close to our house. There was no forgetting on those nights. None of us dared to leave the living room when they were close. If we really couldn't hold it in, we had to do it in a bucket. You might be wondering what exactly drove us to such extremes. The thing is, I don't know any more than you do. I never saw anything. No one ever talked about what happened on the last day of every month. It was like it didn't happen. I asked my parents once, when I was very young but old enough to finally realize this wasn't a normal situation, what was out there on those nights. My father shrugged. Evil, he said. I don't think he knew either. But it was evil, of that I'm sure. We could feel it in our bones, an animal instinct rising up as the night got closer, warning us that something was wrong in this place. It was always sunny on the last day of the month, but it always felt cloudy. I noticed that as the years went by. Every time, the daylight felt bluish, yet it also looked like, well, just your perfectly normal sunny day. It never rained. The temperature was always 22 degrees Celsius all day, regardless of the season. The birds still sang, and dogs barked, but they sounded underwater, to me, at least. Like I said, nobody mentioned what happened during the night. If others noticed these things, they kept it to themselves. Maybe they preferred to enjoy the normal days and face the night only when it came. I don't know. The rest of the month, everyone lived a normal life and even seemed happy. Not me. I just lived in nauseous expectation of the next night. Like I said, I never saw them. But I heard them. On those hellish, noisy nights, when they chose our home to haunt, they'd remind us that the danger was very real. We would hold our breaths, hearing them try every lock, looking for the one we'd forgotten. They were as meticulous in their attempted invasion of our home as my parents were in its defense. They would turn the handles, pull them, and make the door shudder as they grew frustrated. They would try to open the windows, making them creak in their frames. Sometimes, and God, those were the worst of all, it would make me hug my grandma tight and weep on her shoulder as she wept on mine, even long after I could be considered a child. Sometimes they tried the chimney. In the complete silence of our living room, we would hear a sound, a very subtle rasping sound, like fingernails sliding down the wall. Then the clicks would start. We hear them, very deliberate clicks on the other side of that steel plate, like an impatient boss tapping his shoe. My father would grab his shotgun, and my grandpa, or sometimes my mother, would take the rifle, aiming it at the fireplace. They shook so badly I doubt they could have hit anything. While they were there, clicking behind the plate, we would feel the wrongness more than ever. The room seemed darker at once. Sometimes I swear it was like one of the oil lamps went out. What light there was felt bluish again. God forbid someone had used the bucket. The smell grew so intense, it was more like gasoline than urine. They would click and click and click. One time they knocked. I will never forget that sound, a polite knock from a friendly neighbor in the form of a warhammer beating on a steel plate. The sound echoed, and the plate was dented. We had to have it replaced. Then there came more clicks, and finally, we heard them sliding up the chimney again. Whoever had managed to not drop their weapon would continue shakily aiming it at the fireplace until dawn. Another time, We heard them upstairs. They got in. I mean, they didn't get in. They couldn't have, or I wouldn't be here writing this. We checked the locks in the morning, and we hadn't forgotten a single one. But we heard them. We heard their footsteps in the room above ours, my bedroom, walking very slowly, stepping on every creaking floorboard. We think they did it on purpose. They want us to know they were there. My father was brave enough to get up and lock the living room door, but then he came to us, and we all huddled together, crying as quietly as we could as they creaked their way downstairs and came to the door. Then they started scratching it. Not like an animal. Not with claws. They just scratched it very lightly. It was dark. I didn't see anything under the door, but it felt like they were there for hours, scratching away at the wood. In the morning, my throat hurt from trying to smother my sobs for so long. I couldn't sleep anymore, even though we were supposedly safe the other nights of the month. I begged my parents to move away. I think at one point I literally got down on my knees and implored them to leave. They told me to be quiet. It was only one night. Nothing had happened. They didn't really get in. We must have gotten too scared and started hearing things, they said. So, before the end of the month, I ran away. I was 15. I've never looked back. Sometimes I regret having been so rash. I miss my family, but I'm afraid of calling them or even sending them a letter. As far as I know, they only haunt that town. I'm afraid that maybe my family didn't move because we're not allowed to leave. I don't know, but I'm too afraid to risk doing anything that could make them find me and spread beyond that town. I still lock every door and window every night now, just in case. I have a girlfriend now. She believes I have OCD and tolerates this behavior, and she's helping me get over my fear of going outside past sundown. I'm afraid she's not having much success. I know she'll probably get tired of trying to fix me and leave. I wonder sometimes if a life like this was worth the escape. What would have happened if they had gotten through that locked door? I don't know that either. All I know is that, very rarely, but still all too often, someone would make a mistake. A husband wouldn't check the locks enough times. A wife wouldn't close the shutters all the way. A child would become curious and open a window just to see. And in the morning, the town would be short one family. No one ever mentioned the disappeared family again. Just like them, it was like they never even existed. Their house would be sold, the new owners would look out for any crack they might come in through, and the months would go on. After what happened on my last night, I'm certain all those security measures were useless anyway. They could always come in any time they wanted. I don't know what they are, what they do to their victims, if they eat them or drag them to hell or unmake them or what. I don't know their connection to that town. I do know that if they want to show me, a locked door won't stop them. I lock it anyway, just in case. There's this painting my wife loves called Death and Life by Klimt. I don't know what she finds so fascinating about it. I made all the right noises when she showed me her beloved framed print when we were first dating, oohing and awing and making up some nonsense about warm and cold color schemes and the specific choice of angles and lines. She was an artist, and our first few dates involved long walks through museums, starting in Picasso's Blue Period and ending in heavy petting and frustration. I took an art history course as an elective when I was finishing up my doctorate. I remembered enough of the lingo to charm my fantastically gorgeous future wife and lure her back to my embarrassingly filthy apartment. Picture me as the stereotypical foul bachelor frog, sitting on a lily pad made of empty takeout containers, surrounded by a pond of unwashed clothes big enough to keep a laundromat busy for 6 months. I remember scrambling to find 2 cup-like containers for the bottle of wine we'd brought back while she was in the bathroom. I rinsed out a couple of coffee mugs and rushed into the bedroom to tidy up, including clearing the remnants of my earlier indiscretions. On the bed, neatly laid out against the chaos, were her dress, bra, and panties. She came out of the bathroom completely nude except for a pair of high heels, took the wine from me, and drank straight from the bottle. That was the moment I felt totally, completely, and irrevocably in love. I have no head for artistic things. I work in finance. I get creative with numbers, not paint, but I adore her work. She's made a name for herself over the past few years. Critics call her the American Damien Hirst. One of her first exhibits featured a dozen oil paintings of rotting pastries surrounding an actual cake filled with thousands of dead ladybugs being fed to a mummified tarantula dressed as Little Miss Muffet. I have no idea what it meant, but it was bizarrely brilliant, successful, and catered by Balthazar, so I ate about 20 croissants. Thankfully, they didn't contain bugs. I checked. She was amazing. She had the body of a Laker girl and the face of a Modigliani model, and still does. She's charming, charismatic, and magnetic, the kind of person people flock to and want to be around. She had a wicked sense of humor, and she loved with a passion that was unparalleled. Once I secured a job with enough digits to keep her in the life she deserved, I proposed and bought her a historical brownstone in the city, complete with a garden full of roses and hardwood mahogany floors. For the first few years, she seemed happy. We were the kind of couple that appeared in New York Magazine and made people roll their eyes at our good fortune. But like all couples, we hit a rough patch. She was still superficially the same woman I fell in love with, stunning, sociable, and talented. But I could see the misery creeping into the corners of her eyes and the downturn of her mouth. It started small. She bought 3 or 4 shower curtains from a boutique downtown, intending for us to choose one together. We decided on a pale blue one made of an impractical and overpriced fabric. But it made her happy, so I didn't mind. Days passed, and it remained unused. A month later, I noticed it hanging in her studio, cut to shreds and dyed into something almost unrecognizable. I let it slide because calling an artist out on their process is like stepping into a minefield. A year later, though, I couldn't ignore it anymore. She became increasingly tense, like she was walking on a razor's edge. Normally, she had too many ideas to contain, but a year passed without a single finished painting. I was worried about her and her finances. Her shows brought in $20,000 each, which funded our lifestyle of European beaches and Aspen ski trips. The breaking point came when she burned the roses. While I was at work, she doused 16 canvases in lighter fluid, set the yard ablaze, and destroyed everything. The fire department called me, and I rushed home to find her sitting in the ambulance, covered in ashes, her blonde hair singed. She was smoking a cigarette. Surveying the wreckage, I asked her why. She exhaled smoke and said simply, "It was mine to burn." She turned the aftermath into art. She photographed the inferno, had the suffocated bunnies mounted, and constructed a phoenix from the charred debris, an 8-foot, 400-pound monument to destruction. The Times called it incendiary. Her first foray into becoming a true artist. Someone bought the phoenix. I pity whoever wakes up to that tortured thing every day. It wasn't until we were drunk at a Dante's Inferno-themed bar in San Francisco that she let her guard down. After a night of dark jokes about the irony of her show and her surroundings, I finally asked what was wrong. At first, she angrily denied it, pointing out that her last show earned quadruple her usual, paying for her damages and this vacation. But when I stayed silent, she softened. Her blue eyes filled with tears. Then she took a shot of whiskey and smirked. "Well, for starters," she slurred, dangling the glass from a bull's nose ring, "I'm fairly certain I'm pregnant." She let the glass drop from her finger, and it shattered on the floor as she slid out of her seat and stumbled to the exit. I sat there for a while, drinking more, feeling furious, confused, and miserable. I remembered her face when she showed me that Klimt painting. I remembered how she wore glasses back then and how she pushed them up the bridge of her nose when she smiled as I talked about the warm and cold colors, the angles, and the lines. We converted her studio into a nursery. Rather, I did, while she stayed in San Francisco and did God knows what with her artist friends. I hired a landscaper to replant the roses. I worked a lot of overtime, drank myself to sleep, and skimmed through parenting books. She came back when she was almost full term. I came home from work one night to find sonogram pictures posted all over the fridge of two healthy-looking twins, big baby girls. I walked into her bedroom and saw her fast asleep on top of the covers, belly swollen, smelling faintly like substances and paint thinner. She had a rainbow of dried paint on her fingertips. I loosened my tie and walked to the nursery. She had been busy. The canary yellow I had chosen was covered in a layer of translucent blue, and she had covered one wall in Klimt patterns and curlicues. The creamy plush carpet was splattered with paint she had worked furiously to finish. She had cut a swathe from one of the new rose bushes and made a giant bouquet, shoving them so tightly into the vase that some had escaped and made their way from their perch on the changing table to the floor. She had scattered them in the bassinet and on the windowsill. It was chaotic and beautiful. The next few years were peaceful, for the most part. We bonded over raising the girls. Despite my wife's less than careful prenatal preparation, they were wickedly smart and beautiful. They both looked like her, with long curly blonde ringlets and blue eyes. Sometimes, when I put them to bed, I wondered if any of my DNA was in them at all. They were like miniature versions of her. My wife agreed to see a psychiatrist for a little bit. She took some medication for a while, Xanax and some mood stabilizers. Eventually, she and her doctor decided her crisis had been hormonal and temporary. We started having dinner parties again and soothed the gossip that had infected our social circles. She stopped painting and took up teaching at a university. She seemed content again, even happier than she was before. Every once in a while, I would catch a look in her eyes like repressed artillery fire, as if she was ready to explode at any second. But it never lasted longer than a few seconds before her eyes returned to the soft cornflower blue I knew so well. And who doesn't get a little agitated every once in a while? I rose through the ranks at work. I loved the feeling of power that came with promotions. I loved my girls. And by God, I loved her, my crazy, beautiful, hateful, loving, extraordinary wife. Then came today. Today, I came home from work early. Today, my wife took the day off to be a chaperone on a class trip to the Met. They had been after her for months because of her expertise in the art world. They wanted the children to experience culture in the most sophisticated way possible. I thought it was ridiculous. They were toddlers in a private daycare. They saw more beauty in Cheerios than in Monet's water lilies. But they wore my wife down, and she was given a gaggle of toddlers and wide-eyed teachers to tour the museum. I came home for lunch because I had forgotten my iPad with notes for a presentation that night. I walked through the rose garden and noticed a tiny piece of sculpture left over from the Ashes exhibit from so long ago. It was half of a tiny bird with the kind of exquisite detail my wife used to be so famous for. I was pretty sure it was an actual bird cast in clay. I thought I could see a small piece of feather in one of the cracks. I idly wondered why I hadn't noticed it before. I went inside and poured myself a glass of orange juice. The fridge had pictures that my daughters drew, happy, crooked stick figures that looked nothing like the beautiful horrors their mother used to churn out. I was happy about that. I hoped they would fall in love with numbers, like I did. It was absolutely silent. I sipped the sweet citrus and enjoyed the nothingness. Then I thought I caught a vague scent of fresh paint in the air. Curious, I walked into the living room. And there was my wife, sitting on the leather couch with a bottle of wine, looking like an angel of death. She was covered head to toe in blue-gray body paint with a special concentration underneath her eyes. She wore a revealing patchwork blue dress covered in crosses of various shapes and sizes. Not a dress, I realized, but the shredded shower curtain from so many years ago. I could see most of her still perfect breasts, the curve of her waist. The bottle of wine was elongated and painted a strange shade of orange. The smell of paint was stronger here, overwhelming with lighter fluid and something else I couldn't place. She had shaved her head. I stared at her for a while, minutes, an hour, maybe. Eventually, she took a swig of wine from the bottle, swirling it around in her mouth. I noticed paint, deep blues and even deeper reds, on her fingers. I sat down in the armchair across from her, unable to think of what exactly I wanted to ask her. Maybe because I knew. Maybe because I didn't want to know. I noticed a camera on the table between us. I went to pick it up, and she rested her gray hand on mine before I could, softly, gently, with all the familiarity of years of marriage. She opened her mouth to speak, soft pink lips made pallid by the paint. They were mine. And I've been sitting here, knowing what's behind the door to my daughter's room, with the clint wall we never repainted. Knowing why my phone keeps ringing with calls from the school and the NYPD. Knowing why I couldn't find my sleeping pills last night. Knowing what that smell is. Seeing, in my peripheral, the red pooling and staining the carpet from underneath the door, the pile of clothes neatly folded next to my wife on the couch. I can picture that thick wire she used to fit all of her subjects where she wanted them. What a perfect, detailed recreation it must be. Because she's so perfect. I see the phoenix in my mind's eye. I hope, when she flicks that cigarette she's about to light, we both burn. I used to do special effects makeup. Now, I'm a makeup artist for the dead. Raucous music shook the window shutters as people paraded past, shouting and singing in memory of those they lost to the other world. Every year, on Dia de los Muertos, my small, dilapidated shop shook. It was on the ground floor of a building so old that the thundering footsteps outside reverberated through the ancient wooden floorboards. I watched the small flames of candles drift past the window, flashes of shadowed faces, sugar skulls, and headdresses floating by like ghosts in the inky blackness. I waited for my next customer, sketching shadows with charcoal idly on a roll of paper, my supplies laid out around me in expectation of guests. While I drew the curve of a forearm, the bell tinkled, and a figure shuffled in, shambling and unbalanced. I looked up expectantly and saw the sagging face of a partially decomposed corpse staring at me. Strings of limp hair hung about its face, its vague shape making me identify it as a her. "Hello, Sonora, please sit," I said quietly, moving out of my seat and pulling out a cushioned chair. The woman stared at me, lips blue and eyes covered with a film of cataracts. Almost blind, but not quite. She dragged herself into the chair, bones clicking and bare feet making a slick sound on the wooden floor, something that once would have disgusted me. I didn't even flinch. She was not my first customer. I sat and waited. After several moments of being observed, a raspy voice spoke. "They say, she began, voice gurgled and almost indistinguishable. I could see the gashes on her throat in the low light, deep lacerations in her trachea. No blood, no gore. An older corpse, I surmised, but with another glance at her eyes, not too old. You can make me look alive," she spat and then gasped for air she had no need for. I looked at her solemnly and nodded. Only living customers were comforted with a smile. "I can," I said, and that was enough for her. She nodded, and I picked up my tools and began to work. After spending years on the sets of B-horror movies deconstructing faces, molding masks, and playing with color, lighting, and shadow to horrify, it was easy to reverse the process. Easy to reconstruct a face. Hours later, a fresh-faced woman shambled out of my shop. No payment from the dead. That was fine. Money was not why I did it. I stared out of the window, saw her body disappear into the night, her face melting into the crowd, deceptively normal. I nodded in satisfaction. For 3 years, I have been the makeup artist of the dead. I still remember my first customer and the blood-curdling scream that escaped my mouth when I saw him. He had limped into my store, torso covered in blood, lips blue, and face swollen. He was a fresh corpse. Unemployed, working and sleeping in the same dusty store, weak with exhaustion, I had collapsed into a heap. I remember thinking, this is the end. Death himself has come for me. Dazed, I had struggled to come out of my petrified state as black spots danced before my eyes. The corpse had dropped clumsily to its knees and dragged itself toward me, eyes wide, blue lips moving in speech. It was the begging, the desperation, that snapped me out of my haze. Please. I won't do anything. I just want to see her. I know she will be in the parade. I just want to see her. He was choking, crying, no tears left for his dead flesh to produce, but the anguish on his face sent a dagger into my heart. Why here? I had asked, struggling, pressing nails into the floorboards to stop myself from running far away in the face of the monstrosity before me. Frankenstein's monster stared back at me. I remember you from when I was alive. You can change a face, he had said, and I'll never forget the look of hope that almost made his swollen, bloated face seem human, seem alive. Please, he'd said, and I had nodded. It took hours to change him, to revisit and practice seldom used, abandoned talents. My hands shook like leaves in the wind. I made mistakes, then fixed them, then made more. 4 hours later, it was done. He had looked at himself in the mirror, shocked, awed, thanked me, and limped out of the door. I did not ask him for payment. It didn't even occur to me. I never knew if he had seen her or who her was to him. I never knew if the fruits of my labor had helped him find solace. The next year, there were more. I knew then that it worked. For the past 3 years, every year on Dia de los Muertos, they shamble into my store, hoping to be alive for a night. Some come to join the parade unnoticed. Others, like him, come to see their loved ones, to hear their voices while they can still pass for someone alive. Some come because they are curious about the magician who brings them back to life, just for a day. I am an artist, putting layers upon layers on pallid, gray skin, breathing life into the lifeless. I have become a surgeon, teaching myself to stitch loose bowels back into abdominal cavities, to mold prosthetic eyes and insert them into empty, cold sockets. Many I have had to turn away, with tears blurring my vision and my heart in my throat, because they are simply decomposed beyond repair. I sketch again, getting charcoal smudges on my fingers, and look up an hour later when the bell rings again. My next customer, for the first time in years, takes my breath away. I jump to my feet, skidding to a halt as the frail corpse enters my shop. It cannot be. No, it cannot. He comes in, closer and closer, and I wonder why he doesn't know. Why? Then I see it, deep gashes around 2 empty sockets. He is blind. I stand there, shaking, trembling, rooted to the spot. Hello, the man says, voice barely there, vocal cords so frayed it's almost an inaudible whisper. I am mute. Suddenly, I am transported back years, to when I stopped speaking. It's as if 2 years of speech therapy, 2 years of psychologists and clinics, never happened. He shuffles closer, and even blind, he can sense my presence. He turns slightly, ears facing me. I wonder if he hears my shuddering breaths, if his hearing is sharp or barely there, a whisper of yesterday. Before he can leave, mumbling uncertainties, I dive forward and place my shaking hand on his shoulder. I can feel the bone beneath it. He looks heartened. "Thank you," he says shakily as I maneuver him into the chair. I open my mouth to speak, but my throat clicks. I feel a sob building, and I cannot speak. I cannot breathe through the headache pounding behind my eyes. "It is okay." He speaks for me. "Am I too late?" He speaks slowly, voice inaudible, a breath that rattles through his deflated lungs. I cannot speak. I put all my concentration into hearing his whispers instead. I must be. "But please," he begs, looking so sorrowful. I stare into those empty, gruesome sockets and pretend I can remember what his eyes looked like. "I just want to hear her, that's all. Can you fix me?" "I just want to stand by the window and hear her," he says and falls silent. Tears roll down my cheeks as I begin with shaking hands. All I can hear is my heart beating loudly in my chest. My vision tunnels until all I see is his face. My hands work using muscle memory, like I am an automaton. Thoughts and memories batter at the walls of my head like hammers and daggers. Years. I hadn't seen him in years. My life had fallen apart. I lost my job, the house, and the same window to which he wanted to place his ear. I never knew what happened to him, but now I did. I never found him, but he has found me. I don't know how long it takes. I cannot hear the tick of the clock. I still cannot speak. When my hands fall away, he notices it is over. "Do I look alive?" he asks, and he does. He looks exactly like the last time I saw him. Before he left my life. Before he was taken from me and replaced with an empty grave for the disappeared. "Oh, Papa," I choke, voice finally free, and his face turns up to me in a shocked jolt. "You look wonderful." I am not a social man, and I have had few friends in my life. Sal, the bartender at my favorite pub, was one of the select few in my inner circle. I know what you're thinking. He's a bartender. He has to be friendly to get a good tip. You're wrong. It goes beyond that. I'd known Sal for over 25 years and sat across from him at the bar almost every day since we met. When I got married, Sal was my best man. When my wife threw me out, it was at Sal's home that I stayed. When she took full custody of my daughter, it was Sal who consoled me. He was a good friend, always willing to listen to me and give advice, like any bartender would. Unlike the other tenders, however, Sal actually cared. Sal was a very private man with a rather quiet demeanor. That said, on the few occasions when he chose to let loose, he talked a lot. Sal had a way of capturing the attention of everyone in the room. This might sound a bit cliched, but he'd regale us with stories of his youth. He told us about his cross-country trips, his overseas adventures, his mishaps, and his entertaining anecdotes. When he spoke, his audience sat on the edges of their seats, hanging on his every word as he gave them the juicy details of his endless tales. He was old now and couldn't travel as often. He didn't seem to mind. He always had a smile on his face and a cheerful attitude that brightened the mood of everyone he came across. One evening, as I was enjoying a drink, I noticed a man in a booth staring at Sal from across the room. At my angle, I could barely make out his short, spiky raven hair. I pointed him out to Sal, and he told me the man had been coming in every night that week, never ordering anything. Sal, being the big softy he was, couldn't bring himself to kick the guy out. Considering I went to the pub every night, I was surprised I hadn't seen the stranger until that evening. I was probably too drunk to notice. Later that night, after drinking one too many beverages, as I tended to do all too often, according to my ex-wife, I passed out across a row of chairs. Sal trusted me enough to leave me there, even after closing time. I woke up long before dawn and made my way through the dimly lit bar to the back door, which could only be opened from the inside. This wasn't my first time taking a snooze alone in the bar, so I knew my way around well enough not to run into any of the tables on my way out. As I opened the door to the back alley, I heard what sounded like applause, but it turned out to be the sound of 36 crows taking flight. They hovered above the cold alleyway for a few moments before landing on and around the leaky dumpster in front. I jumped when I saw the damn birds. I'm not afraid of crows, mind you. I even feed the ones at work during lunch. They startle me, is all. A hunter's moon peeked through the clouds and illuminated the scene. There was someone standing on the other side of the dumpster, in the forest of crows. It was the man I had seen earlier that night. He had his back turned to me, wearing a black trench coat and boots laced with multiple buckles. A large crow perched on his shoulder. Something was odd about his back. A bulky mass moved under his coat, causing it to shift like curtains in the breeze. The dumpster smelled particularly putrid tonight, I thought. I glanced at the stranger, who stood between me and the street. I moved toward him and saw that his crow was chewing on something. At first, I thought it was a gummy worm, but as I approached, I realized it was much darker and oozed crimson blood onto the cold, wet pavement. Then, I saw Sal. He lay on the ground, his body ripped open, serving as a buffet for the hungry crows. They pecked at his innards, taking turns chewing on his softer organs. I could hear the crunching sounds as they broke apart his bones with their abnormally strong beaks. Bringing a hand to my mouth, I emitted an audible gasp. The sound caught the stranger's attention, and he slowly turned to face me. His golden, serpentine eyes reminded me of headlights. Something in his left hand gleamed in the moonlight, a short silver dagger, its edge covered in liquid that belonged in my friend's veins. I should have been terrified, angry, sad, but I felt strangely calm. My eyes were transfixed on the surreal scene and the man at the center of it all. Though he held a weapon and had used it to murder my friend, I did not feel as though I was in any danger. The man gave me the quiet smile of a Grecian statue, projecting calmness despite the feeding frenzy at his feet. His footsteps echoed down the narrow alley as he made his way toward me. My heart thumped hard in my chest. Paralyzed with fear or disbelief, I watched him outstretch a hand to my face, with a gentle elegance seldom attributed to the male gender. The crow on his shoulder tilted its head as its master scraped his long black nails against my cheek. I felt a faint stinging sensation, no worse than that of a paper cut. The man gave me an amused hum as he brought his fingers to his mouth and tasted a few drops of my blood. I'm not sure how long it took me to snap out of the shock, but when I finally did, I looked toward Sal's final resting place and saw that there was nothing left of my old friend, not even a drop of blood. The stranger turned his back to me, and a sudden flood of adrenaline compelled me to grab a wooden plank from the floor. I threw myself toward the man, but stopped all of a sudden when his trench coat slid off. Two massive black wings clung to his back like climbing vines. Black veins led to and from the appendages, which flared out with a sound similar to that of an unfurling sail. The man gave me one final look and spoke to me in a deep, booming voice. "You'll thank me one day," he said. With that, the crows took flight, and the man disappeared. I was left alone in the alleyway as the sun rose, no evidence of the man, his crows, or my dead friend. I tried going to the cops, but what could I tell them? I sat in front of the police station, going over the facts in my mind. They'd never believe that some sort of crew demon and his army of minions ate Sal. I ultimately chose inaction, hoping I'd merely suffered a booze-induced nightmare. It was no nightmare. Sal was reported missing by the pub's owner a few days later. An investigation began, and what the police uncovered shocked even me, who had seen a guy get eaten by a flock of crows. They found evidence linking Sal to no fewer than 15 cases of missing children. He had kept trophies of their remains hidden in a safe under his bed. Then it hit me, the reason for Sal's frequent trips in his youth. He'd been doing the wretched deed far from home so he wouldn't get caught. This may sound weird, but I am still grateful for Sal's friendship. As I explained earlier, I'm not a very social man. When you get to be over 20, it becomes a lot harder to meet people outside of work, and the friends you do have tend to drift away. Sal helped me through tough times, and I'll always be thankful for his friendship. I still mourn him, not the bad parts. I mourn the loss of the man I thought he was. It may seem strange to you, but that's how I feel. These days, I've stopped drinking. I haven't set foot in that pub since the day Sal died. My ex and I even got back together. I get to see my kid every day, and that is the greatest gift of all. I guess in a way, losing Sal was one of the best things that ever happened to me. On my way home from work yesterday, I saw Crow with familiar snake eyes gleaming like headlights. He gave me a knowing nod, and I knew we understood one another. Among the horrific things found in Sal's home, they had retrieved a fully packed duffel bag, a single one-way ticket to Mexico for the day after he was killed, and hundreds of photos of my wife and daughter. The Crow Man saved them. And that, my friends, is why I smiled at that crow and uttered two simple words: thank you. My girlfriend talks in her sleep. She's been saying the most horrible things recently. I'm infatuated with her. Utterly infatuated. And it wasn't at a healthy level. Far from it. I would think about her every moment she was away. I would sometimes sit on my couch and just stare at my phone, waiting for her to text. I'd tell myself, don't contact her. Don't. It will come off as too strong. But then I'd still find myself clicking her name on my contact list before my inner voice would continue. You don't want her to know how desperately smitten you are with her. It's unattractive. It will scare her off. No, you must wait for her to call you this time. But it was excruciating and exhausting. Almost unbearable. I once heard that the ancient Greeks believed that falling madly and irrationally in love with somebody was a curse you would wish upon your enemies. I could never understand what they meant. After all, isn't falling head over heels in love the ultimate goal nowadays? But now that it's happened to me, I have to say, the ancient Greeks were right. This is a curse. I was barely in control of myself, almost as though my infatuation with her had possessed me. The two of us were sexually active together, but still in the dating phase. We were at that make or break era of a blossoming relationship where we'd either have the talk and formally be in a relationship, or we'd start to slowly drift apart. The latter of which I don't think I'd be able to cope with. Honestly, I wouldn't be able to. Almost everything about her captivated me, the way she held her hand over her mouth when she laughed, how she caressed the pendant of her necklace when she was frightened, how she tore her hair in her fingers when she was excited. All of it. Her smell. Her smile. Her eyes. Yeah, I know. It probably makes you sick reading about it. I feel the same way. I was never the hopeless romantic type. But now I can't stop fantasizing about her. I think about us doing the long 3-hour hike up to that magnificent view from one of our first dates. To that first kiss, as we overlook the lights of the city. But this time, I get down on one knee, bring out the ring, and, well, you know what would happen next. Alright, fine. I'll stop. Yes, this is a girl I'd only been casually dating for a couple of months. I shouldn't be thinking about proposing yet. I know that. I'm just barely able to control myself any longer. I feel as though I'm losing power over the decisions I make. And that brings me to why I'm here writing this out at the moment. It started with the first real thing that troubled me about her. We'd never actually spent a night together. No matter how late she was over, once either of us showed signs of being tired, she'd up and leave. She wouldn't leave awkwardly or in anger. Just a casual kiss goodnight, a smile, and a call me soon. It was something I didn't really even notice the first few times she did it. But after almost 8 weeks of dating, it was becoming strange. I'd have to ask her about it. It took drinking almost an entire bottle of wine before I had the courage to do it. She looked almost defeated when I asked and lowered her eyes in embarrassment. I knew this talk would come eventually, she started. She took in a deep breath with a long, drawn-out exhale. Recently, she paused again. I've started talking in my sleep. She shook her head in embarrassment. It's called somniloquy. I looked it up. I shrugged and laughed out loud. My demeanor seemed to say, "That's it?" "No, Stephen, listen," she said. She wasn't laughing. "It's bad. It's completely out of control. It's not just random words or gibberish. No. It's horrible. I say horrible, disgusting things." She was starting to raise her voice, breathing heavily and tearing up. I approached her and held her. I told her it couldn't be that bad. I told her to spend the night. I told her she was probably exaggerating. I was wrong. That night she stayed at my house. But she warned me of something before falling asleep. "Whatever you do, don't wake me up. It makes me really scared and disoriented if that happens. And don't respond to me. Just ignore it." I nodded and agreed. "If it becomes too much," she continued, "just leave the room and sleep on the couch. I won't mind." I told her not to worry about it. I told her that it wouldn't be a big deal. I told her I wouldn't leave for the couch. I'd stay beside her in the bed. But I was wrong. I couldn't even last one night. We both fell asleep without incident. I don't know how many hours passed, but I woke up in the dark with the sensation that someone was watching me. And then I remembered. She was with me. She was actually spending the night. I smiled. But then I noticed the shadowy outline of her sitting up on the bed. She was looking down at me. Staring. It creeped me out, I'll admit it. Her posture was entirely different. It was as though it wasn't even her at all. Then she spoke. It wasn't her voice that I heard. It was much lower and gravelly, like something out of a horror movie. "I'll chew the skin from your bones," she said. I froze. At first, I just kept looking at her. This was not at all what I expected. I thought it would be more like the way Tourette's is often portrayed, just random swearing and shouting. I honestly thought to myself, what will I do if she attacks me right now? What if she really does try to chew the skin from my bones? But then she just lay down and went back to sleep. I was creeped out. I tried to lie back down and ignore her, but struggled. I couldn't even close my eyes without thinking, maybe she's sitting up again and staring at me. And then, one time, I rolled over to look at her, and she was. Her face was pressed right toward mine. Her breath was foul and rotted, something that was most certainly not normal for her. She spoke again, in the same voice as before. "If you don't move to the couch, you'll be dead by morning." That did it for me. I sat up in a moment and headed for the living room. She made some sort of wheezing sound as I left. I think it was supposed to be laughter. I was lying on the couch, but I wasn't going to be able to fall back asleep. I was far too shaken. I was staring out toward the window, hoping to see the first few hints of the sun rising. And then I thought I heard something from the bedroom. I listened, and then I heard it again. Stephen. It was that same low and gravelly voice. It sounded like a witch. I tried to just ignore it at first. But then it continued. Stephen. Still, I said nothing. I know you can hear me, Stephen. You're awake now. Why don't you come back into the bedroom? The voice barely sounded human. Or maybe you prefer if I come to you? I still didn't say anything. I was told not to. But I listened. If I heard her start walking toward the bedroom door, I'm not even joking, I would have run right out of the apartment. But she had asked me not to respond to her sleep talking. So I didn't. And then I heard her once more. Sorry if this spoils your plans. She began laughing. The two of you were supposed to walk that trail again, she started. I wasn't even remotely prepared for what she'd say next. You'd both be so tired when you reach the top. You'd look over the city. Then you'll get on one knee and bring out the ring. She began laughing. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a problem with sleep talking. It was something much more. Something supernatural. I had never told anybody about my proposal fantasy. There was simply no way she could have known about any of it. This was no longer about merely talking in one's sleep. This was about possession. I can't go back into the bedroom. I have no idea what would happen if I did. Instead, I'm going to wait it out, holding up in my living room until the sun rises. I have a couple more hours yet. I can hear her laughing occasionally in the bedroom. It's still not her voice. Still that same low-pitched cackle. But as I sit on my couch writing this out, here's what scares me the most. Maybe my infatuation and utter obsession with her wasn't normal. I said before that I felt like I was losing control of myself, more so, I believe, than the typical falling in love story. No. I fear that the infatuation I felt was the entity slowly taking control of me. Of it controlling my thoughts, fears, ambitions, and anxieties. Maybe once I become completely absorbed, a transfer would occur, and she would be free of it. I know I should leave. That I should open the front door, get in my car, and drive away from here. But I can't. I can't leave her. I've already lost control. I'm infatuated with her. Utterly infatuated. My sister's ex won't stop showing up even 2 years after her death. When my sister Lisa died 2 years ago, our family changed forever. We weren't perfect before, who is? But Lisa's death fractured us. My dad barely speaks anymore. My mom busies herself with every charity event she can find, and I've been stuck. Angry. Looking for someone to blame. Lisa was the glue that held us together. She was warm, outgoing, always laughing. The kind of person people gravitate toward. She loved hiking, photography, and the outdoors. Her death, officially ruled an accident, was almost poetic. She slipped while hiking and fell into a ravine. At least, that's what the police report said. But if that's true, why does it feel like her ghost never left? Lisa's ex-boyfriend, Matt, was never part of our family. He and Lisa dated for about a year before she broke it off. She said he was controlling, obsessive, constantly texting, showing up unannounced, making passive-aggressive comments when she spent time with her friends. I remember her joking about it once, calling him her stage 5 clinger. But it wasn't funny. Not really. After the breakup, Matt didn't take it well. He kept texting her, leaving voicemails, even sending her flowers at work. She brushed it off, said he'd get bored eventually. I thought she was right. Until the funeral. Matt didn't come to the service, thank God. But a week later, he showed up on our doorstep. It was a rainy Thursday. My mom opened the door, and there he was, holding a bouquet of lilies, Lisa's favorite. I just wanted to pay my respects, he said. His voice was soft, his head tilted like he was trying to look vulnerable. My mom, who has never been good at saying no, let him in. Matt sat on our couch, talking about Lisa as if he knew her better than we did. He described her laugh, her smile, the way she always ordered pancakes with extra syrup. My dad stayed silent, his jaw tight. When Matt finally left, I asked my mom why she let him in. He's grieving too, she said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Matt wasn't grieving. He was lurking. Over the next few months, Matt kept appearing. He showed up at family barbecues, holiday dinners, even my dad's birthday party. Always uninvited, always with some excuse. Your mom said it was okay, he'd claim, or I thought Lisa would have wanted me here. My parents, blinded by their own grief, let it slide. He's harmless, my mom said. He just misses her. But it wasn't harmless. Not when he started asking questions. Last Christmas, Matt cornered me in the kitchen. She was different with me, you know, he said, leaning against the counter. I stiffened. What's that supposed to mean? He smiled, that thin, unsettling smile I'd seen so many times. She told me things she wouldn't tell anyone else. Like what? His smile widened. Like how she wasn't scared to die. That night, I went through Lisa's journals. She was the type to write everything down, her thoughts, her plans, even little grocery lists. Most of it was normal Lisa stuff, song lyrics, doodles, random observations. But then I found the entry. I think Matt's been following me. He won't stop texting. Keeps saying he knows something I don't. I'm starting to feel like I can't shake him. I showed it to my mom, expecting her to finally see reason. But she waved it off. Lisa was dramatic sometimes, she said. I'm sure it's nothing. A few days later, I saw Matt's car parked down the street. It wasn't the first time. I'd noticed it before, idling near the corner, but I convinced myself it was a coincidence. This time, though, I knew. He wasn't watching our family. He was watching me. Last week was my dad's birthday. Matt showed up, holding a gift he claimed Lisa would have bought, a coffee table book about hiking trails. I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted him outside, away from my parents. What are you doing here? I snapped. His smile didn't falter. Paying my respects, he said. Lisa broke up with you. She wanted nothing to do with you. Why can't you let her go? His eyes darkened. She told you that? Yes. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. She told me a lot of things too. Things she didn't tell anyone else. Then he said something I'll never forget. I was there, you know. On the trail. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. What? He smiled again, a cold, empty thing. She didn't fall. She looked me in the eyes and asked me to let her go. My stomach churned. You're lying. He tilted his head, studying me. Am I? Ask yourself this. If she slipped, why didn't she scream? I called the police that night. I told them everything, the stalking, the journal, his confession. When they went to his apartment the next morning, it was empty. No furniture, no clothes, no sign he'd ever lived there. It's been a week now. I haven't told my parents what he said. I don't know if they believe me. Every night, I double-check the locks. Every night, I sit in my bed, clutching my phone, too scared to sleep. Last night, I finally decided to look through Lisa's journals again. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I missed something. Maybe I was looking for answers. But this time, there was something new. The last page, which had been blank before, now had a single sentence scrawled across it in jagged black ink. He's not watching. He's inside. My friend was brutally murdered in her sleep this weekend. When the police found her, she was lying on top of her duvet, covered in her own blood, with a slit in her throat. No trace was found of her killer. Upon retrieving some things for our family today, I stumbled across her diary. What you will read below is her account of the last 7 days of her life. Monday, July 9th, 2018. Dear diary? I guess? I don't really know how I'm supposed to start this thing. The therapist recommended I acquire some kind of journal to help catalog my thoughts. It's supposed to keep me grounded and in the present if I start to have another panic attack. So here we are. It's Monday the 9th, and I'm supposed to be at work right now. Except I'm not. I moved house today to a new build condo in a quiet suburban street. I had something of a mental breakdown earlier this year that left me hyperventilating on the wrong side of the guardrail on the Golden Gate Bridge. It took 2 agonizing hours of talking to a police officer to convince me not to embrace the void and to choose life instead. I was then immediately whisked away to a hospital to be evaluated by a psychiatrist. The next day, I went home and immediately listed my apartment for sale. There were too many memories left there that I didn't want to keep, and I needed a fresh start. My new place is exactly what the doctor ordered. It's a modern 2-up, 2-down, I think that's what it's called, townhouse. It really has all the things a growing millennial needs: USB ports in every outlet, high-speed Wi-Fi, good cell reception. I'm in love with the place. There's an open-plan kitchen and living area towards the back with these amazing floor-to-ceiling sliding glass doors. These lead to a cute little deck and a tiny patch of grass I'm told is called a lawn. I wouldn't know. I've only ever lived in apartments. Towards the front, there's a spare room which, until I have more money, is going to remain unfurnished. It will probably just end up as a storage closet for the stuff I couldn't leave behind when I moved but definitely don't have a need for. Heading upstairs, which is honestly more of a mezzanine, there's my bedroom and bathroom. The bedroom sits at the back of the house, above the deck, and the bathroom takes up the front. The whole place is wide open, spacious, and it lets the light in. It feels like my soul is taking a big breath of fresh air. I have a neighbor, and I'd assume that their house is a mirror image of mine. I've not met them yet, but I hope that I bump into them soon. A little human contact couldn't go far amiss in my new life. I guess I should go and unpack some more of my stuff. It should help to ease my anxieties about my new place if everything is in some kind of order. Do you say goodbye to a diary? I have absolutely no idea. There needs to be a guide about diary etiquette online somewhere. So it's like 10:30 p.m. I've just got back to my room after a frantic search around the house for my breaker box. Can you believe it? 12 hours in the house and I get a power cut. I fell asleep with the landing light on, and I guess the sudden absence of light woke me up. I jumped out of bed and initially thought I was blind. Suburbia is really dark at night. My eyes eventually adjusted enough to penetrate the darkness. I fumbled my way down the stairs into the kitchen and grabbed the flashlight off of the fridge. It's one of those cheap magnetic ones. I received it as a gift in a stocking one Christmas. I flicked it on and scanned the kitchen for the breaker box. It wasn't in the kitchen or the living room. It was in the spare bedroom, behind 4 boxes of my junk. I moved the boxes and lifted the lid to the breaker switches, but nothing had tripped. I was just thinking about which number I need to dial to get some kind of idea of the situation when there was a dull thud followed by a sharp click. Confused and out of sorts in unfamiliar surroundings, I held my breath for about 5 seconds, and then I heard the hum of the fridge. The power was back on. I emerged from the spare room into the partially illuminated kitchen and approached the fridge to reattach the flashlight. I thought I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye just as I was about to turn and head for the stairs. It looked like there was a figure out on the deck. I rushed for the outdoor light switch. It was one of those really bright halogen security lights. They're usually activated by proximity but need to be reset in the event of a power cut. There was a burst of light onto the deck and the lawn behind it. There wasn't a trace of anything. No figure, no footsteps, not even any poop from an animal. Whatever shadow I thought I had seen evaporated like mist. I think I'm losing it again. Already. Tuesday, July 10th, 2018. Hello, diary. I apologize for my minor outburst last night. The internet tells me that what I experienced was a rolling blackout, and I guess my mind was just playing tricks on me. Today is my first day back at work after a week off, so I'm stressed and honestly a little anxious about that. I work as a graphical artist for a bank. I produce their advertisements, customer-facing posters, and emails. It's really fun work, but there are tight deadlines, and I'm constantly trying to please everyone. Hopefully, my first day back isn't quite so intense. With a bit of luck, I won't have to endure another power cut tonight. Diary, there's a footprint on my deck. Not a set or a trail of footprints, just one enormous, muddy boot print right outside the sliding doors. If I were to put my foot where the print sits and close the doors, my toe would be pressed right against them. Someone was standing at my door. I didn't catch it last night because it was dark and the deck is stained a deep chestnut color. I don't know what to do. I've called the police, but they completely dismissed me. I'm sorry, ma'am, there's nothing we can do without an intruder actually present. I called my friend, Matt, to stay over for the night. He said he'll crash on the couch, which makes me feel a little more secure. I think if I can spend one night in the house without a disturbance, I'll feel better. At the end of the day, it was one boot print. It might have been there before I even moved in, for all I know. I'll have forgotten all about it in the morning. Wish me luck, diary. I'm turning in for the night. Wednesday, July 11th, 2018. Good morning, diary. I slept like a log last night. No nightmares featuring big-footed, muddy intruders inexplicably appearing on my deck. I found Matt sitting at my breakfast bar when I arrived in the kitchen. He claims he didn't experience anything out of the ordinary last night, aside from some creaking in the house. With it being a new build, I'm willing to put this down to the house settling or me turning over in my sleep. I'm feeling incredibly positive today. I'm falling in love with the new house. I'm starting to feel safe, and I've just had breakfast and coffee before work for the first time in years. I'll be late home from work tonight. I've been invited for drinks with some colleagues as a sort of welcome back celebration. It'll be nice to get out of my head for a while, even if it is aided by alcohol. Thursday, July 12th, 2018. The back door was open this morning. I came downstairs to get a glass of water and some painkillers to alleviate the headache I had as a result of last night's antics, a thoroughly deserved headache, I might add. I felt the cool morning air raise goose pimples on my neck and make the hairs on my arms stand on end before I reached the bottom of the stairs and located the source of the chill as I rounded the corner. I don't remember much of last night after getting home, but I'm fairly confident I didn't touch the door. I'm not a smoker, and I haven't owned a pet for years, so there was no logical reason for me to have opened the back door last night at all, let alone leave it wide open. I'm going to the hardware store immediately to pick up new, heavy-duty locks, and I've got a locksmith arriving later this afternoon to install them. I have an appointment scheduled with a security company later this week to get an alarm system installed with a remote panic button. This situation is slowly deteriorating into something that I can't explain away as month-old footprints and strange sleeping behaviors. I'm going to go around to the neighbor and see if they've heard or experienced anything similar. I'd definitely feel better if I had a nearby friendly face that I could turn to for support. I can't keep calling Matt every time I make a stupid mistake when I've had one too many daiquiris. I don't think anybody lives next door. I knocked on the door and rang the doorbell, which still worked, surprisingly, and received no answer. After some observation, the house was absolutely spotless externally and internally. I'm not sure that it was ever inhabited. Every window on the ground floor is covered with a pair of heavy blackout curtains except for one, the front room. Peering through the window, I could make out a solitary wooden chair in the middle of the room, facing the window. I saw no evidence of any other furniture, past or present. There were no indentations on the carpet, no empty boxes, no discoloration on the walls. It looked as if the house had remained untouched since it was built earlier this year. I don't feel comfortable about this at all. Something just doesn't feel right. I'm going to ask some of the other people in the neighborhood about the house and see if they can shed some light on this for me. In the meantime, I'm going to invest in a safety chain for my front door. I don't feel safe anymore. Friday, July 13th, 2018. Friday the 13th. One of only 2 unlucky days this year. I'd like to say that I don't believe in superstition, especially as my therapist believes that it doesn't have positive effects on my mental health. However, today has been extremely negative for me. My declining attention at work has caused them to put me on short stress leave. My supervisor believes that I may have returned to work a little too soon, so I've been told to take this Saturday and the entirety of next week off to get my stuff together. I think I'm just going to spend the entire time in bed. I don't have the energy for anything else. My locksmith hasn't been able to get out to my house yet either. It's apparently break-in season, whatever that means, and he's been snowed under with lock changes. I've bought and attached a safety chain to my door. It's funny, I don't even know what I'm trying to keep out at this point. I just want to feel comfortable in my new home. It happened again. There's no way this is a coincidence. 2 power cuts in 5 days in a new build? I can't rationally explain this away. I wasn't even asleep this time. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and fantasizing about the Golden Gate Bridge when my thoughts were rudely interrupted by a sharp click and a dull thud from outside. I was plunged into almost complete darkness and started to panic. My heart started pounding like it was attempting to crack open my sternum and escape my chest. My breathing became shallow and rapid, like oxygen was suddenly in short supply and I needed every molecule that was available to me. I sat bolt upright, no longer in my stupor, but suddenly very alert. I listened hard for any sound that might seem out of the ordinary. I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own breathing and the constant pounding drumbeat in my chest. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and gingerly dropped my feet onto the carpet. I had recently relocated the flashlight to my bedside drawer and I hastily retrieved it. After a few seconds of fumbling around with shaky hands, I found the on switch and the darkness gave way to an orange glow that now felt familiar and offered a tiny scrap of comfort for my jangled nerves. There was a creak from downstairs. I entered the landing and listened with bated breath. I wasn't sure if I was preparing to run or to club an assailant with my tiny flashlight, but I was prepared for something. No sounds. I crept down the stairs, one at a time, listening for the faintest sound. After 5 minutes of silence, I was satisfied that my kitchen was free of intruders. I approached the back door and gave the latch a solid tug. It was locked tight. I headed to the front door and ensured the safety chain was still secure. My final stop was to check the spare room for the breakers. I'd left the boxes out of the way from last time. If I'm honest, I haven't had the energy to rearrange or unpack them. Unsurprisingly, the switches were all up. In my complete panic, I had dialed 911. Feeling my cheeks flush a little with embarrassment and regretting having been so hasty, I retired to the couch to await the arrival of the police and thought of what I would tell them to convince them I wasn't either crazy or wasting their time. The police arrived with a knock at the door. I approached cautiously and opened a tiny crack through which I could check that they were actually police. When I was sure, I carefully slid back the safety chain and eased the door open for them to come in and search the house for intruders. They seemed distracted with something else, as if they had better things to be doing, which they probably did. Their search was basic, checking under beds, in wardrobes, with just a cursory glance into the bathroom. I was left with a copy of a police report and the instructions to dial 911 again if I felt unsafe. Sleep came for me there on the couch around 2 a.m. and I awoke with a start just now at 5:35. I'm tired and I need coffee. Forget this house. Diary. Saturday, July 14th, 2018. It's around 4 p.m. now and I'm too tired to function. Still no word from the locksmith or the security company. I'm not sure this police report will protect me if push comes to shove. I spent the past few hours on the phone making plans to get out of here. I have an Airbnb from tomorrow and 5 apartment viewings this week. I'll have to rent this place out and write off my plans of my dream home. I'm going to pack everything I need and get an early night. I'm leaving very early tomorrow as I have a pretty decent drive to make. On the move again. I hope this isn't going to be a recurring theme for me. Sunday, July 15th, 2018. Hi there. Diary. I did not move out this morning. I found myself unable to leave my bed and unavailable to answer the phone. I made some mistakes this week, diary. I think it was good that I bought a security chain for the door. It's smart, cheap, and simple. Double-checking doors and windows is also a great plan when one fears an intruder. The security system would have proven to be overpriced and ineffective had it arrived before my departure. The new fancy deadbolt would have appeared to have been of little use also. These things only serve to keep intruders out. My first mistake was checking in on the house next door. I forgot to lock my door. Or maybe it didn't occur to me as necessary. I was only feet away, right? What could possibly happen? My second mistake was falling asleep on the sofa yesterday morning. It was careless. I was exhausted from my ordeal and, after seeing off the police officers, I neglected to reset the chain on the door. My final mistake was being so loud on my phone throughout the day on Saturday. Anybody could have heard my plans to leave. And so quickly too. It was almost like I was fleeing. That would have been smart. You see, I was right in my Friday panic. There was a reason to be scared. He was hiding behind the shower curtain. The police didn't see the muddy print on the floor, nor did they see the sprinkles of dirt on the bath mat. They didn't even turn the light on. When I left for coffee, my uninvited houseguest crept under my bed and waited. When I retired to bed early, he waited for my breathing to become slow and deep. He then emerged, slowly and silently. He rose up beside the bed like a ghoul and produced a blade. A beautiful thing, obsessively cleaned and meticulously maintained. The blade was pressed against my throat for a brief second before it glided across, and all my blood spilled out. I gasped for breath. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. with my eyes wide and my hands clasping at my throat, trying in vain to staunch the crimson flow. I'd imagine my last thought was a wish that I'd spent a little extra cash and got that Airbnb one night earlier. My life faded, and I collapsed, motionless, on top of my duvet. The man then reached under my mattress, produced my diary, and proceeded to fill in my final day. Wouldn't it be such a shame if I'd ended the week on a Saturday? And B. If you are reading this, maybe check behind your shower curtain before locking yourself in for the night. My husband started teasing me after I suffered a serious head injury. I literally can't go on like this. Back before my head injury, my husband and I had this cheesy ritual. If I ever got held up late at the office and needed to catch the last train home, he'd wait for me at the station and accidentally brush against me as I disembarked at the platform. He'd put on a bashful voice, acting like we were meeting for the first time, and say, "I'm sorry I bumped into you, ma'am, it's just you have the most distracting green eyes. Could I maybe walk you home?" And every time, it made me melt like butter in a hot pan. Yes, I know I'm lame. But one night, the platform was empty when those automatic doors hissed shut behind me. My stomach lurched. Exiting the station, a concrete set of stairs sped you out into a long, filthy, poorly lit underground tunnel, and this was the real reason for Darren and I's tradition, because neither of us liked the idea of me walking home by myself. As my calls went unanswered, I stood there, my leg bouncing up and down. Lampposts flicked on beyond the iron fence surrounding the station, and the sky grew darker until, finally, I saw no choice other than to set off as quickly as I could. Inside the underpass, sputtering halogen bulbs were spaced out every 10 meters or so. I half walked, half jogged from one flickering pool of light to the next, inhaling through my mouth to avoid the combined stink of 1,000 relieved bladders. Halfway along, a rapid skitter of footsteps rushed up behind me. I spun around. My chest collided with something solid, then two hands shot out and grabbed me by the wrists. In the dim light, I could make out dark hair and a set of deep, blue eyes. I heaved a giant sigh of relief. "Darren." "Darling," the man answered. Altogether, the hairs along my arms and neck stood on end. It wasn't my husband. My brain went into full-blown panic mode, which means the rest of the encounter is still a giant blur, but I know I lashed out with punches and kicks. My fingernails raked the man's left eye and gouged his nose. He kept yelling something, but it was impossible to hear beneath my screams bouncing off the walls. At one point, I bit down on his hand, hard, and his skin's rough texture is the part clearest in my mind. After that, there are images of me lying in a gathering pool of blood while the man apologizes, and if I really squint my memory, there's confused glimpses of sharp teeth intermixed with a haze of darkness. From there, everything jump cuts to a ring of empty faces towering over me. Those faces were like the expressionless mannequins you see in shop windows. With my heart in my throat, I thrashed around in a soft bed, screaming until the mannequins rushed to restrain me. Then I rode off into a wave of blackness. Next time the world slid into focus, a single mannequin was beside my bed, dressed in a nurse's uniform. A soft, disembodied voice came floating along, promising everything would be okay. From somewhere close by, the continuous beep 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 of a heart monitor gathered speed, and, gradually, I realized I was in a hospital. I swallowed a lump and asked the nurse what happened to her face. The voice asked what I meant. I said the nurse's skull looked as if, when God designed her, he'd loaded up Photoshop and gone crazy with the smudge tool. It was a smooth mound of pink flesh. The faceless nurse explained I'd suffered a serious head injury and showered me with kindness and support while a series of torches got shone in my eyes and my vitals got checked a dozen or so times. The voice kept telling me not to move around too much, otherwise, the stitches across the top of my head might have popped loose. Another figure with an empty skull, this one dressed in a doctor's coat, came and stood at the foot of my bed, and that's when I first heard the term prosopagnosia, also known as face blindness. The condition can result from a traumatic brain injury. What followed was a flurry of activity. Darren, who I only recognized by his haircut and voice, was allowed to sit with me. I squeezed his hand throughout the onslaught of tears and endless visits from neurologists. On his way to the station the night of the attack, Darren had seen a newly licensed teen driver slam on their brakes way too late to stop at a red light. An old lady got sent careening into the air, and Darren called for an ambulance while he applied pressure to the poor woman's chest to keep her from bleeding out. That was the reason he missed my calls. A woman named Tracy and her German shepherd, Buster, were drawn to the tunnel by my screams. Tracy sicked Buster on my attacker, who bolted off in the direction of the station, covered in my blood. Both Tracy and Buster visited me at the hospital, and we posed for a photo, which made the front page of the local newspaper. The story about a hero dog included a blurb about my condition, even though we specifically asked the reporter not to include it. 2 police officers, who I could only distinguish by their difference in height, questioned me about my attacker. Judging by their irritated voices, they'd hoped to learn more than his hair looked sort of like Darren's. Although it took days of interrogation, I convinced Darren to reveal what else authorities knew about the man. It turned out, after Buster chased him to the platform, the jerk took off running along the curved track. Tracy called the police, who went after him, flashlights in hand, but only discovered a discarded backpack a quarter-mile north. So far as anybody could tell, my attacker dropped it while climbing a fence to escape into the loading bay of a warehouse. Inside the pack, they found intrusive photos of me, along with journal entries and love letters filled with strange details about our supposed relationship. The officers said he might have been stalking me for as long as half a year, living out a fantasy in which we were husband and wife. Their promises they'd have him in custody soon rang a little hollow. In the weeks I spent confined to the ward, I got a crash course in how difficult life with prosopagnosia really is. Dressed in their identical hospital gowns, my fellow patients were impossible to tell apart unless they had a unique feature, like green nail polish, and I suffered a mild panic attack every time somebody in my inner circle changed their hairstyle or bought a new outfit. After a whirlwind of scans and tests, the doctor suggested I should consult a specialist, although I could tell they hadn't much faith I would ever recover. Good thing I never wanted to be a police sketch artist. Because some of the intrusive photos were taken from the back garden, Darren and I moved to a new house on the opposite side of town. Anytime I caught a glimpse of my reflection, my pulse launched into the stratosphere, so I insisted we not keep any mirrors. Early one morning, a fortnight later, a stranger with a profile matching my attacker's knocked on the front door. I'd already grabbed a vase that sat on a nearby side table when, in a silly voice, Darren said he was sorry to bother me, but that I had the most beautiful eyes he'd ever seen and presented me with a bouquet of roses. He was teasing me again, playing make-believe like old times. Now on the verge of a heart attack, I told him I needed to sit. He apologized 1,000 times. I told him it was okay, but that I prefer we never did that silly role-play game ever again. He, of course, agreed. In the weeks that followed, my confidence in my ability to read people swelled. Everybody had a tell, be it a tendency to wear noisy jewelry or a compulsive habit of scratching their ear. In time, I adapted to this new way of seeing, or not seeing, the world. Until tonight. There we were, watching Rick and Morty in the bedroom. I'd never liked cartoons before, but since the diagnosis, live-action stuff had become tricky to follow, so I gravitated towards anything with bright colors and distinct patterns. Afterwards, as I lay facing the wall and scrolling through Reddit, Darren pulled on his navy robe and shuffled off downstairs to use the bathroom. I was still reading the same post when footsteps came marching along the hall. Straight away, my skin prickled. Why? Was it the speed? Or maybe the rhythm? As the door creaked open, I glanced over at Darren, still in his robe. By the time he crossed the room and slid in next to me, my spine was slicked with sweat. I could still smell the woody scent of his cologne, so what set off the alarm bells in my mind? As an arm reached out and coiled around my stomach, my heart thrashed against my chest. At the corner of my eye, a blank face stared straight at me, silent and unmoving. The way that rough hand probed my stomach and the taste of those foul breaths, it all evoked memories of the tunnel. I rolled toward the wall, suddenly trapped beneath the hot cavern of bedclothes. And that brings us to now. I can't tell if I'm being paranoid or if the figure beside me is my stalker posing as my husband. If it is my stalker, he must have learned about my condition from the article and is living out his fantasy. I'm afraid of what might happen if I run or call the police. I'm not even letting myself think about what happened to Darren. But it could also be I'm freaking out over nothing, like before. There's no way to be sure without making it obvious unsuspicious. So I'm just gonna lie here pretending to browse Reddit until whoever's beside me's breaths fall into a slow, rhythmic pattern. Then I'll slip away as quietly as I can. So if you don't hear from me again, you'll know my instincts were correct. Wish me luck. I'm writing this with the last pencil I'll ever hold. My name is Megan Reed, and I'm 17. I live in Hillsboro, Wisconsin. My family recently moved here because of the cheap property, and it happened to be where my father was raised. Drawing has always come naturally to me, so I constantly have a sketchbook and a few pencils in my bag. I have an interesting ability. I can take a snapshot of an image I'm looking at by blinking. I can recreate the image on the paper as if I were staring at it the whole time. Hillsboro has many old and interesting houses, so that has been the subject of many of my recent drawings. The town isn't very large, so I like to take strolls down streets. I pick houses that pique my interest and draw them. My life changed on one of those strolls. I walked down the central street of the town, Mill Street, and decided to turn left and go down Field Avenue. I came across a house on my left with grass that came up to my waist in the front yard. It was a Victorian-style house. The windows were broken in a few places, and the paint was peeling, though I could tell it used to be violet. I decided this house was the lucky winner for the day. I blinked my eyes while looking at the house, locking the image in my mind. I sat down with my back against the short picket fence and pulled out my sketchbook and pencil. I let my fingers do the work while my mind wandered. I thought about what I was going to have for dinner tonight. Mom told me that shepherd's pie was for dinner. It's a favorite of mine. I just remembered I have history homework due tomorrow. The homework thought broke my concentration. I looked down. The drawing was near completion. I captured the circular portion of the left-hand side of the house, ending at the tip of a cone. The right-hand side looked good as well, a downward V shape with two windows below it that looked into the second floor. The second floor extended slightly farther than the first floor to allow an overhang for the porch. Each column looked to be in place. The man standing next to the door, smiling. Wait a second, the man standing next to the door? I didn't remember seeing any man. I stood up and looked across the grass to the front porch. No man was in sight. I took another look at the man in my drawing. I didn't draw his body in very good detail, just some light shading. The face was more detailed. I drew both his eyes and his mouth. The eye sockets were pointed toward me, and they didn't have an iris. The mouth was smiling, a very toothy smile. The mouth looked disproportionate. It seemed to extend from ear to ear instead of spanning the length of the eyes. I decided that was enough house drawing for today. I really shouldn't let my mind wander while I'm drawing. I packed up my things and headed home. When I arrived back at Millis T, I saw a very interesting old car. It looked like a Volkswagen Beetle, but I could tell it's been around a few decades. I decided to take a snapshot image for a drawing later. I arrived home a little after 6 p.m. Mom had already prepared the dinner table. The shepherd's pie had steam rising off it. Dad was in his study, on the phone. Mom told me he would be a little late to the dinner table. His meeting was running over. The shepherd's pie was delicious as always. Sometimes I dream about it even now. I excused myself from the table to go relax in my bedroom. I lit a few candles on my desk and sat down in the seat. My favorite place in the house, my drawing desk. Many memories and drawings have been made at this desk. I always need to draw the snapshot memories before I go to sleep. They always seem to leave my brain after a restful sleep. I brought my pencil to the paper in preparation to draw the old Volkswagen Beetle on Mill St. Long smooth strokes to draw the hood connecting to the curved roof. Short, forceful pencil strokes to draw the black tires. Light shading for the door to show the sunlight touching it. Short, light strokes for each tooth in the smile. The smile? I looked down to see that I was halfway through drawing a face in the driver's seat. That's not right. There wasn't anybody in the driver's seat. Maybe I was mistaken. I brought my pencil to the paper to finish the face. The face was pointing to the left, directly where I was standing. The mouth was too long. It shouldn't be that long. My breath started coming in short bursts. I brought out the drawing from the house earlier that day. I placed it next to the car drawing. The smile was the same, but the eyes and ears were detailed in the car drawing. The eyes had more of a pointed glare than the empty sockets from the first drawing. The ears were slightly tipped at the top. The rest of the body was still only gray shaded. I put the pencil to the car drawing, hoping to fill out the details of the rest of the torso. I could not. I felt like I shouldn't, but I needed to know. I looked to the right, where the door to my room was located. I blinked my eyes. I pushed the other drawings out of the way and placed a new sheet down. I began drawing. The door, dark brown wood with light flickering from the candles on it. The bronze handle. The blue jacket hanging from the hook on the back of the door. The hand reaching toward me. I jumped out of my chair, looking toward the door. There was nothing there. I looked at the drawing on the desk. Long nails on 4 fingers were reaching out, open-handed, toward the center of the page. I reached out with my hand toward the doors. Something brushed my hand. I screamed and threw open the door. I ran into the preacher table in the hallway, knocking over one of my mother's favorite vases, and I fell to the floor. I tried to prop myself up, but the floor was wet. There was never any water in the vase. I looked down to find blood running onto the floor from 3 gashes in my forearm. My mother and father appeared in front of me. My mother turned a ghastly white at the sight of the blood. My father picked me up and ran me out to the car. I don't remember much of the ride to the hospital. I'm lying in the same bed that I'm writing this letter from. It's been a week since I was brought here. They have me on suicide watch. The doctor told my parents the slashes on my forearm couldn't have been caused by the vase. I've only tried drawing once since I've been here. The man is still here, if you can still call him a man. The last drawing looked more like a beast than a man, crouching at the foot of my bed. I'm too scared to draw anymore. Once this letter is finished, I'll never hold a pencil again. I'm not sure what this thing wants with me. I can always feel a presence around me, shadows dancing out of the corner of my eyes. I just wanted to warn you, so it doesn't happen to you. If you sense something following you, don't acknowledge it, and it won't acknowledge you. Christmas Day 1999, was and will likely remain the most terrifying day of my life. I was a young woman pursuing my dream of forensic anthropology at Boston University under Professor Mannis. He was my mentor, intelligent, tenured, and inspiring. Our class had taken trips to his body farm in upstate New York a few times throughout the semester. It consisted of a variety of environments perfect for studying various rates of decomposition: dense woods, thick brush, open fields, ponds, creeks, sheds, cabins, and even a swampy marsh. In the center of it all was the Mannis home, an ancient yet beautiful colonial tucked beneath the massive pines. On the last day of classes before winter break, Professor Mannis gently grabbed my arm as I was leading his lecture and asked me to sit with him for a few moments. As we sat and sipped coffee, he asked what my plans were for the holidays. The question was unexpected but not off-putting. I told him I was going to stay with my friend Jess. He asked why I wasn't spending it with family, and I went on to explain that I had grown up in the foster system. He apologized profusely, to which I told him it was okay. Professor Mannis took another drink and told me he would be spending Christmas, as well as the remainder of winter, with his sister's family in Florida, leaving his estate and the body farm vacant. I smiled softly as I realized what he was about to inquire. "You're the top student in class by far. How would you like to work on the Mannis body farm this winter as part of your PhD program and continue my research while I am down south?" he asked. Christmas with the corpses. I couldn't have said yes faster. If only I had known the horrors that awaited me. I pulled down the long gravel drive in my old Civic, and the mansion came into view. It was even more beautiful in the snow. I parked the car, walked to the front door, and unlocked it with the large brass key Professor Mannis had given me. I was beaming. There were 5 specimens planted on the property that I was to study. Subject 1, female, elderly, 36 months deceased, field. Subject 2, male, adult, 2 months deceased, sealed barrel outside of the shed. Subject 3, female, elderly, 8 months deceased, inside shed under tarp. Subject 4, male, young adult, 13 months deceased, dry creek bed. Subject 5, female, young adult, 2 weeks deceased, bank of pond, submerged. I gave each specimen a nickname based on their location. There was Fiona Field, Berry Barrel, Sheila Shed, Craig Creek, and Polly Pond. Immature and unprofessional? Maybe, but it helped me keep track and made the morbid reality a little easier to deal with. To be honest, the work was easy, quick, and uneventful. Unfortunately, this did not last long. Each morning at 9 a.m., I would make my rounds and notate each specimen's current stage of decomposition, as well as any signs of wildlife interference. It was solemn and a bit eerie, but I was doing good work that would help the criminal justice system and forensic scientists. At least, that's what I told myself. Things had become routine by the 3rd day. I would put on my latex gloves and medical mask, followed by my snow gear. Most of the specimens could be studied visually from a short distance, with the exception of Berry Barrel and Sheila Shed, whom I would have to examine physically due to their respective shelters. The subjects were decomposing at their expected rates. All but one. I walked to the edge of the pond and stared at Polly, frozen beneath the ice. Her head seemed to rest comfortably on the bank, while her eyes remained a blank slate gazing towards the winter sky. Polly's feet were a blur of white as they stretched toward the depths. The scene was almost peaceful, as if she were merely a statue resting beneath glass, perfectly preserved in her own display case. I stared at Polly's naked body, ready to jot down my notes. My eyes descended from her head to her neck, chest, abdomen, and finally down to the thin, dark strip of hair between her thighs. I stepped back as an unexpected sensation pulsated through my body. I felt embarrassed. Her nude body reminded me of my own, and I felt a sudden impulse to cover her. I laughed awkwardly to myself and scribbled the remainder of my notes. Satisfied with my morning's work, I trudged up the snowy hill towards the house to make breakfast. I spent the remainder of the day working on my thesis and watching local television. As the sun set, I drew a bath to unwind. I rested against the back of the clawfoot tub and closed my eyes, soaking the day off my skin. For a brief moment, my head submerged under the warm water, and an image of Polly's pale skin and milky eyes flashed in my mind. I shot up out of the tub, angry with myself for falling asleep. As I began to dry off, a loud thud outside broke the quiet stillness of the night. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, but my sense of logic and reason wouldn't allow me. Instead, I concluded it must have been local wildlife. I was miles away from any other person, and no one in their right mind would be rummaging about the property in the cold at night. My attempt to calm myself was failing. I quietly crept down the creaky stairs and made my way to the sliding glass door at the back of the home. I slid it open and examined the property with my flashlight. All remained still besides the light, falling snow. I decided I would investigate in the morning as I closed and locked the door. Looking at the clock, I reasoned it wasn't too late to call Jess, selfishly knowing her voice would make me feel less alone. We spoke for an hour before I went to bed with all the lights on. That night, I dreamt of red flowers blooming through the white snow. The following morning was dreary and still. I brewed coffee and listened to the news. A storm was coming and projected to hit on Christmas Day. After breakfast, I geared up and began my rounds. Almost immediately, I saw what had made the loud noise in the night. The barrel near the shed had fallen over, and Barry's stiff, decomposing arm reached out towards the fresh snow. I approached cautiously. All seemed plausible at first, figuring the barrel must have toppled from wind or wildlife. Professor Manis had warned me of local coyotes and their appetite for human remains and bones. I pulled the barrel upright and inspected Barry. As soon as I saw his hand, my heart began to pound in my chest. The nails of his index, middle, and ring fingers had been pushed back as if he had clawed at something. I grabbed the barrel's lid from the snow and ran my fingers along the grain. Towards the center, I noticed 3 symmetrical scratches. I felt like I was going to vomit. I sealed the lid and began to think. I told myself it was the result of the barrel toppling over. His hand fell towards the lid, and the momentum caused the lacerations when his nails made contact with the wood. It made sense. There was nothing to worry about. I continued with my rounds. The specimens appeared intact and unmoved, giving me a sense of peace and security until I came to the edge of the pond. I could see Polly as I approached and immediately felt as though something wasn't right. I crouched down and examined her body once again. There was no embarrassment this time. I sat along the bank for a few minutes before it hit me. Polly looked like she was closer than she was the day prior. I quickly grabbed my measuring tape and extended it towards the icy corpse. Her head was 2 inches closer to the bank than it was the day before. The nausea and panic returned in full force, and my mind began to race for an explanation. "It's fine," I repeated to myself. Temperatures change, and the water beneath the ice is still fluid. The corpse simply shifted in the night. I started to feel better and laughed at myself for being frightened. The solitude was simply getting to me. I finished my notes for the day and retired to the house. It was Christmas Eve. I deserved a little bit of fun. After lunch, I put on a Christmas record and made eggnog. The house felt warm and alive, and I found it a welcome change from the usual eerie stillness. A few drinks later, I was finally feeling relaxed. I began rummaging through the Manis home in search of Christmas decor. I found myself at the basement door before remembering the professor's strict instruction to keep it closed and stay out. Half an hour later, I was satisfied with the 2 wreaths and strand of tinsel I discovered in a storage closet near the guest room. I melted into the couch with a freshly refilled glass, and my eyes grew heavy as Sinatra's rendition of Silent Night served as a lullaby. Just before I drifted off, 3 loud knocks at the back door jolted me awake. I wasn't able to explain this. I felt adrenaline pulse through my body. Maybe I had drifted instantly into a dream the second I closed my eyes? This idea was shattered as 3 more knocks rapped the glass of the sliding door. I ducked down to the floor and contemplated my next move. The door was locked. I was sure of it. I knew then the best idea was to make a dash to the phone and call the police. Just before I took off, a muffled voice from the other side of the glass spoke. "LYSS, open the door, please." I could have died if I hadn't started laughing so hard. Jess had come to surprise me. I unlocked the door and slid it open, nearly killing her with a hug. My eyes welled with tears at the realization that she had traveled to the Manus farm in the snow just to spend Christmas with me. After catching up and a few more drinks, Jess proclaimed that this wonderful evening would most certainly not be right without a Christmas tree. Warm from alcohol and our snow gear, we decided to head into the woods to chop down a small pine before the sun set. As we neared the shed, I thought of an idea that, at the time, I believed would be hilariously brilliant. I told Jess to go into the shed and grab the axe under the tarp since I had to check on one of the bodies in the back. I remember her distinctly saying, "As long as I don't have to see one of those things, I'm happy." I sat back and grinned ear to ear, waiting for Jess' screams as she would soon discover Sheila under the tarp. The screams never came. Instead, Jess emerged from the shed with the axe and said, "I didn't see any tarp, but the axe was leaning against the wall by the door." You know, for such a smart girl, you've got a terrible memory. I put on my best fake smile and bantered with her. My mind silently raced. She must have missed it, that's all. It's a dark shed. I'll check in the morning before the storm hits, and all of the bodies will be fine. We proceeded into the woods until we found the perfect little tree to chop down and drag back home. The night consisted of even more drinks, a little cannabis, and old memories. It was more than enough to help ease my anxiety. Jess and I eventually retired to the master bedroom and fell asleep as soon as our heads hit our respective pillows. The next morning blessed me with the Christmas hangover from hell. After a gallon of coffee, fried eggs, and bacon, I suited up for my routine 25-minute workday. Groggier than usual, I shuffled through the fresh powder towards the shed. The snow was starting to pick up, and I knew I didn't have much time. When the shed came into view, I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. The barrel had toppled over once again, but this time the corpse within was nowhere to be seen. I ran inside the shed, and just as I feared, there was no tarp and no Sheila. I sprinted to the field and dry creek bed, both of which were absent of their deceased inhabitants. Racing down the hill to the pond, I stopped and vomited when I reached the bank. Polly was gone as well. All that remained was a perfect, body-shaped cavity in the ice. My adrenaline was back in full swing as I beelined to the back door of the Manus home. Jess was smoking on the couch and nursing her booze flu. My frazzled appearance got her attention as she asked me if I was okay. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the phone and frantically dialed the number that Dr. Manus had given me, which instantly went to an answering machine. Through my broken words, I was eventually able to articulate that all of the bodies had gone missing. Jess began to pelt me with questions, none of which I was able to answer. As the winter storm raged outside, Jess and I came to the grim conclusion that our only option was to lock ourselves in and wait it out. Few words were spoken as several hours flew by. The storm continued to increase in intensity as the gray, winter sun set beyond the tree line. Jess and I continued to comfort one another as night fell, telling ourselves that we would wait out the storm and leave first thing in the morning. We triple-checked the doors, windows, and kept the fire burning in the hearth. We felt secure and warm. This was short-lived as a loud crash hit the roof and the lights went out. I heard Jess wince in the darkness, and I held her close. I whispered that it was okay, and the storm must have broken a tree branch outside. We made our way to the kitchen and grabbed the flashlights from under the sink. Jess suggested that we should check the fuse box, and I reminded her that the basement was off limits. Annoyed, Jess hissed that she preferred not to freeze to death on Christmas Day in a creepy body farm mansion. It was a compelling argument. A wave of musty air hit me as we opened the basement door and descended the stone stairs. I pleaded with Jess to be quick as we scanned the walls with our flashlights. Something about the basement didn't feel right, and I wished at that moment that I could be anywhere else. Jess walked over to the breaker and flipped them to no avail. As she worked, my eye was drawn to a stack of photos on a wooden table in the corner. I began to tremble as I flipped through them. All of the photos were of me, candid and dating back to my first year at the university. My voice cracked as I called Jess over to look. She looked me in the eye and said, "We have to leave now." I silently agreed. We scaled the stairs as fast as we could and shut it, only to be greeted by a snow-covered Dr. Manis sitting on a chair in the foyer. A shotgun rested lazily next to him. I nervously spewed words and sentence fragments, telling him that we only went into the basement to look for the breaker, followed by a procession of confused questions as to why he wasn't in Florida. "I got your message, you worry me, Alicia," was his only response. Grabbing the shotgun, he motioned Jess and me towards the front door. We obeyed without hesitation. "Why are you here?" Jess asked as we marched in the blistering snow. "I heard my specimens are missing," Manis hissed. The beam of our flashlight struggled to cut through the darkness, but I knew we were nearing the shed through muscle memory. The crunching snow quieted as a wide-eyed Jess stopped dead in her tracks. "What's the problem?" an annoyed Professor Manis asked. Jess did not respond and continued to stare, all color draining from her face. I pointed my flashlight ahead and saw them, the silhouettes of 5 familiar humanoid beings standing completely still in the snow. Manis whispered, "It worked," as he ripped the flashlight from my hand and slowly continued towards the row of figures. Jess quietly grabbed my arm and pointed to the pickup truck keys clipped to his belt. Jess and I shook our heads in silent agreement. "Absolutely incredible," Manis proclaimed as he approached them. He couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. I squeezed Jess's hand tightly. It was now or never. I lunged forward and grabbed the keys as Jess pushed Manis down onto his face. The shotgun fired as it made contact with the ground, blowing a hole through the chest of the corpse directly in front of him. The flashlight beam shot through the torso like sunlight escaping the clouds. "Run!" Jess yelled, snapping me out of shock. I turned and followed her towards the house. Manis screamed incoherently as he struggled to find his footing. Another shotgun blast sounded as speeding BBs whistled past my ear. I screamed. I looked back momentarily as Manis shrieked at the top of his lungs. In a split second, I saw the corpses descend on him like pigs at a trough. Manis tried to shout once more but merely choked as his mouth filled with blood. Jess fumbled with the keys as we climbed into the 4x4. We were both bawling our eyes out as we fishtailed down the gravel drive toward the main road. The next few months were filled with police interrogations, interviews, and an official resignation from the university. The official record states that the Manis estate and farm were abandoned. The specimens on record, as well as Manis himself, were never discovered. The Christmas season is approaching again. It is always a difficult time of year for Jess and me. I've never had the confidence to share my story with others, but now I think it is crucial should I disappear. You see, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox yesterday. There was no postage, return address, or signature. The note simply read, "It's time to finish our study." My wife's 34F, a biotech engineer, and I'm 39M, a self-employed artist. I mostly do freelance installations, but I've been branching out into murals on the side, so we've never really been able to talk to each other about our work. In 2017, she picked up a government contract and had to sign some sort of NDA stopping her from talking about her job at all. Combined with the weird hours, the long shifts, and the time she had to fly all the way out to Santa Rosa for some kind of week-long conference, it had been really hard to keep anything going between us. Anyone who's been in a long-distance relationship or had a spouse or partner relocate somewhere else knows how hard it can be to keep a connection going. She was clearly tired all the time, with none of that spark that kept us both going through education and the tedious crawl of job searching for the first time. She even came back one week and had a breakdown in my arms about how she wasn't sure if she wanted to continue in her field of study anymore and if what she was doing was right. Like I said, my wife can't tell me specifics about her job, so I assumed she was taking the tedium and exhaustion really poorly and wishes she had taken a job that was better for her, like mechanical repair. She's always been really into automobile restoration. Anyway, we did sit down and have a good conversation about where to go from there. We ended up going to the couples therapy session that my wife's colleague recommended, which was covered by her workplace insurance. We stopped going after 2 sessions because of the conflict with my wife's work schedule, but the advice we got was great. He asked us to think about what we loved about each other and what drew us to each other in the first place. We both agreed it was that playful spark of us in college and how easily we take a joke and spin it out into an elaborate little world that no one but the two of us were privy to. He suggested that we bring some of that on-the-spot whimsy back after my wife returned from her conference. So we started pulling small pranks on each other. I'd spend an hour or 2 in Photoshop and print out a label. The next day, she'd go out the front door and discover we accidentally received a package of premium-grade fresh air that was supposed to be delivered to Atlantis, Georgia. She'd take some of her official workplace stickers and slap a biohazard, dispose, or dangerous if swallowed label on my favorite brand of sunflower seeds. One time, she took all my multivitamin gummies out of the bottle they came in and put them into an official-looking Class 5 psychotropes pill container. We come into the room and start talking seriously about how strange it was that they found Gruyere cheese on the moon. Couldn't anyone see that it was just branding and it was actually aged cheddar? Some of the stuff was really elaborate too, like I went all out with the time I glued all our outdated, don't worry, kitchen utensils and furniture to the ceiling so it looked like we were upside down in the house, but I still can't figure out to this day how she did some of the stuff she did. There was this time her silhouette in the corner of my vision seemed warped for a couple of days. Although she looked perfectly normal every time I turned around to look at her face on. Some kind of foam padding or a shaped wig, I guess. Things went great for a while. They got even better after her project wrapped up and she was able to come back home properly and just relax. She said she'd been given a 3-week paid vacation after the project, which sounded a little strange to me, but I've never been properly employed by a company on contract, so I was just glad to have my wife back with me. I asked her again what she had been working on, but this time she just smiled and told me to ask again in 10 years. We got Indian takeout that night. She gave me all our Madras curry, which I thought was weird at the time because she's always loved spice. When I brought it up, she told me it was because she was cultivating a new tongue implant that had to incubate for 30 days before it could be harvested, though, so that set us off on another back-and-forth romp about the various body parts we were growing. We decided my hand was an experimental limb infused with rhino DNA, and I forgot all about it. Anyway, the pranks didn't stop now that she was back at home. I assumed that since we have more time to spend together now, we'd just fall back into the natural state of affairs we had before she took the job. But she kept blanking out at certain times, keeping me on my toes around the house. She doesn't seem to remember a lot of the inside jokes we had back in college. Once, I saw her having what seemed like a pretty normal Zoom meeting with a colleague in her office, but it still weirds me out to think about. She was speaking straight gibberish at the screen, but he was nodding and talking back like he could understand every word. Some of the pranks aren't even really funny, they're just strange, and I don't get what she was trying to go for. I found a micro SD card between the sofa cushions while I was deep cleaning the other day, and I plugged it in to check out what was inside. It was just a 6-hour shaky close-up video of what looked like industrial tile, focusing on one of those endless motion flamingo desk toys. And there was nothing but shaky breathing in that desk toy, and my wife's hand reaching out to get it moving again every so often for the entire 6 hours. Just shaky footage of that click-clacking desk toy, like she was afraid to focus the camera anywhere else. Anyway, that's what brings us to what I'm here to talk about. Sorry for the long ramble up there, but I feel like that background is necessary for why I'm reacting the way I am. I got a package in the mail yesterday, and it contained a little USB drive and a handwritten letter from my wife. The letter said that it was a secure failsafe that she had set up with her attorneys years ago, and it was supposed to be sent to her spouse and family members after she didn't check in with them for over 5 years, presumably in case of death. I was a little wary about plugging in the USB drive, so I googled how to set up a sandbox on my laptop in case it had a virus or something. I didn't need to worry. All of it was just legal wills and records, plus an honestly very sweet photo gallery of her favorite childhood memories, her family, and me, dated from before 2017. I guess she wanted to give me a present and show me the good times we've had together, but why 2017? And am I wrong for feeling like she stepped over a line here? I appreciate the sentiment, but I can't be the only one to feel like the delivery was in poor taste. I'm a pretty nervous person in general. These things have always scared me, and I really didn't like reading a letter from my wife where the first sentence in it was, "If you're reading this, I passed away." I still haven't talked to her about it because I'm not sure how to bring it up. I'm hoping you guys will have some advice for me. I'm typing this up from my phone right now because I'm still awake and my wife's in bed with me. She's gone to sleep already, breathing deep and even in smooth, but I'm not sure I want to stay with her here for the rest of the night. Mostly because when I sat down to read that letter at the kitchen table, her handwritten grocery list was right next to me. It made me realize that she never used to cross her T's. Let me start off by saying that my wife doesn't believe in paranormal entities or anything of that nature. We have 3 cats, and one of them likes to be a rebel, jumping onto counters and meowing at the top of his lungs just looking for attention. He does this throughout the night, and it's a regular occurrence. Last night, after a few beers and video games, I decided it was time to head to bed with my wife. When I woke up this morning, my wife was basically attached to me with wide eyes and a nervous look on her face. I asked her what was wrong, and she proceeded to tell me what happened last night. She said that around 2:50 in the morning, she was woken up to a noise that sounded like one of our cats downstairs meowing unusually loud. After giving herself a few seconds to perk up and fully pay attention, she said that the meow sounded more like a person trying to mimic a cat, and it kept saying hello. After meowing for 2 to 3 minutes, a loud bang came at our door, and then a notification went off for a motion sensor at our front door. When she told me this, I checked my phone, and sure enough, there was a notification for motion detected at 2:52 a.m. I asked her why she didn't wake me up so I could grab my gun. She said she was frozen with fear and didn't want it to hear her make a noise. We're out running errands while I'm typing this, but something made me uncomfortable about her story. Last night, I set the home security alarm around 9 p.m., and we didn't turn it off until we walked the dog this morning. To make things worse, we had slept with all of the animals in the room, and the door was closed. so whatever was in our house or outside the front door was not one of our animals. Obviously, the first thing that came to my mind was a skinwalker, but maybe I'm just being paranoid. I checked all the rooms in the house after I got up. I'm not sure what I could have done anyway. It's very odd that my wife was scared so badly by something she doesn't necessarily believe in. We bought this house brand new, so no one has lived here before. When I'm home alone, I do feel like I'm being watched or someone's always walking directly behind me. My wife also said that the house has given her chills since we moved in. Something is just off about it. We just got home, and I went to hang up one of my shirts in the master bedroom closet when I noticed that the board that covers the attic access has been shifted a little. When I asked my wife about it, she said she's never been up there, and the builders would have placed it back in its original place before we made the purchase. I'm genuinely getting anxious just thinking about what could be going on. Has anyone had an experience like this? Or similar at least? We're going to my mother-in-law's to get some sage. My wife said burning it should keep whatever surround our house away. I own a journal written by a serial killer. When I checked it this morning, I found a new entry. My first true crime novel was published in early 2011. The book followed the 4-year career of a serial killer in southern Illinois, covering the grisly details of his murders and eventually ending with his arrest. The book was absolutely perfect. I poured hundreds of hours into research, interviews, and writing. I was convinced that it was my sure ticket to a life as a famous author. My publisher had other plans. They claimed that money was far too tight and that they had to cancel my marketing campaign. It was just a coincidence that they abandoned me as they pushed hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of resources toward another author. So, of course, my novel failed. Of course, no one bought it. And if there's one thing publishers avoid more than unpublished amateurs, it's authors with a single failed book. I've spent the last few years trying to cobble something together that might convince them to give me another chance. When I heard about a string of murders in my town, it seemed like the perfect opportunity for a comeback. I poured myself another glass of whiskey by the light of my computer monitor. My ice cube had melted 3 glasses ago, but no matter. I couldn't slow my research into the killer's background, his victims, his method of murder, all of it. I took a sip as I reread another police report. The killer had used a fire axe to commit the crimes. Very gory, that was good. Gory murders always sell better than boring firearm-related crimes. Even better was the fact that he'd killed families instead of single people. That was yet another angle I could exploit. I clicked on a news clip from the night he'd been arrested. The best part of this case was the fact that the lunatic had turned himself in. I drained the rest of my glass, already planning what I'd write about that. Family serial killer with a conscience? I made a list of names to contact the next day. The police raid on the killer's apartment had been highly publicized, so I knew exactly where he lived. I looked up the landlord who owned the apartment complex and wrote his number down in a little notebook I carry around. A few well-placed lies might give me a tour of the killer's private quarters. I woke up the next morning with a splitting headache and nausea, but I didn't let that slow me down. I rolled over, took a shower, and went out to meet with the landlord of the apartment. He was a tall, portly man in his late 40s. He seemed friendly and more than a little stupid. He unlocked the door for me and showed me a few of the rooms. The apartment had been almost completely cleared out by someone, first the police, and then movers, I guessed. I nodded along as the landlord continued the tour of the apartment, showing me the kitchen and then the master bedroom. I knew the killer had a habit of hiding bodies inside crawl spaces from my research, and I was on the lookout for them. I noticed a vent in the corner of the master bedroom that looked to be pressure fitted into the wall. Seems like a great place, just the kind of thing I've been looking for, I said, wiping away the post-drinking sweats growing on my forehead. You mind if I use the bathroom before we finish here? The landlord pointed to the master bathroom. Be my guest. I purposefully spent a long time in there, hoping he'd leave the bedroom. I was rewarded when he called out, I'll be by my car downstairs when you're finished. I left the bathroom and crept up to the vent. I pulled hard on the metal and was rewarded as it slid smoothly from the wall. Inside was a space about 2 feet wide and 1 foot tall. It extended back into the darkness for several feet at least. And there, lying in the dust on the metal floor, was a leather-bound notebook. I snatched it from the ground, hardly believing my luck. It was thick and well used, but I stuffed it inside my shirt for the time being. Replacing the metal grate was harder than pulling it off, but I managed it without making too much noise. I returned to the landlord outside, turning to look up at the small apartment. I'm going to be honest with you, I said. How's that? He asked, confused. I'm Jim Sullivan, a true crime novelist, I said. I'm here to find out if there's anything interesting left about your most recently departed tenant. The landlord's face clouded over with anger. So this was a waste of my time, then? I was wondering if you had any information about. Not for liars. Get off my property. I never want to see you here again. I thanked him and returned to my car, my mind already on nothing but the thick leather booklet inside my shirt. I rushed home, guarding the notebook like a goose with a golden egg. I prepared my desk with a spiral notebook and a blue pen ready by my right hand. Then, trembling, I opened the notebook. It was far better and far worse than I could have ever imagined. The killer had written his planning of the murders in excruciating detail. He explained how he watched the houses, how he waited to see whether or not the husbands loved their wives, whether or not the children were disobedient, what kind of dinners they ate, and at what time. He must have stalked them for days beforehand. But the details in the planning were nothing compared to the details in describing the murders themselves. I had to pause halfway through reading my account. He kept describing the look on the father's face as his wife died. I poured myself a tall drink, drained it, then poured myself another. The killer languished in the description of their cries, their last dying moments, their pitiful supplication for mercy. I finished the bottle before I finished the notebook. After his account of the fourth family murder, the pages of the book finally, mercifully, went blank. When he finished describing the desecration of the last corpse, I closed the book with trembling fingers. My head throbbed from alcohol and the horrible images racing through my mind, but I couldn't help but hold my hands to my mouth in joy. What a find! What a treasure trove of information! 100 years of interviews couldn't give me what this one book had just dropped into my lap. I was going to be famous again. I laughed out loud to the empty room, picked up the already empty bottle of whiskey to my lips, and licked at the last drops before walking to my bedroom. I woke up late the next afternoon, feeling woozy. It was something worse than a hangover. I must have drunk more than I'd been planning to. But could anyone really blame me after reading those horrible things? No, of course, no one could blame me. In fact, no one could blame me if I had another drink right now to ease the horrible throbbing in my skull. I got to my feet and walked to the kitchen. I cracked open a beer before walking back to my desk. The notebook caught my eye as I passed. It looked different somehow, thicker. I picked it up and realized that my blue pen had been lodged inside the leather-bound notebook. I opened it and saw a brand new entry that hadn't been there the night before. I sat down at the desk, trying to make sense of this new entry, written in handwriting different from the others. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was reading. In similar, meticulous detail, it described how I had gone to a house up in the mountains and killed a young couple on their honeymoon. I read about how I'd killed the husband and taken the wife's body back with me. I immediately jumped to my feet and ran to my computer, Googling the address furiously. Had I written this in some kind of murder and alcohol-induced sleepwalking? The address was real. It was a house just a half hour away. And there were no news articles about any murders in the area. My breathing quickened as I stared at the house. The descriptions in the notebook matched it perfectly. It wasn't my handwriting, but there was no doubt it was different from the other entries. And it had been written with my pen. I Googled the nearest payphone, marked the location, and drove there. I dialed 911 with a gloved hand. 911, what's your emergency? A voice on the other end asked. Can you send someone over to a house for me? I'm concerned that something bad may have happened. Sir? What do you? I cut her off, giving the address instead. Did you get that? I asked. She started. I repeated the address, then hung up. I drove back to my house, thinking hard the entire way. God, I needed a drink. My garage door opened, and I drove inside. It was only then that I noticed the axe on the ground. I closed the garage door and rounded my car. An unfamiliar axe lay on the ground beside the door to my house. I knelt and picked it up to inspect it. The metal head was crusted with blood and hair. I stumbled back, holding my hand to my mouth. With no monster left from the darkness, I dropped the axe to the floor and walked inside to open another bottle. I spent the next hour constantly refreshing the news and praying for what must have been the first time in years. Please, I begged. Please let this be some big misunderstanding. Please. It only took 3 hours before the double homicide was front page news. I was already in a haze at that point. Every single detail was correct. Husband dead, wife missing. I realized then that I hadn't looked around my house. The wife's body was somewhere, after all. Wouldn't she be in the house of her killer? The notebook had been silent on her final location. I spent the next hour searching my house for places where I might have stashed her body, but came up empty. A strange, bizarre revulsion toward the notebook came over me. It had caused this. I wasn't sure how, but I knew that if I'd never picked it up, I wouldn't have that axe in my garage nor a conscience so weighted down by, no, that wasn't possible. I had to get rid of it. I briefly considered burning the notebook but rejected the idea. No, something told me that the book belonged back in the apartment where I'd found it. I drank a shot of espresso to sober up, then started walking. The apartment was just a few blocks away, and I figured I'd already caused enough harm for one day. The night was cold, but I barely felt the chill through the haze of guilt, confusion, and fear. I reached the killer's apartment 20 minutes later. One of the ground floor windows was unlocked, allowing me to slide inside. I closed it behind me and looked around the apartment. The other killer had turned himself in, hadn't he? He had a conscience. My mouth turned down into a snarl. It wasn't my fault, even if I did do it. It was this cursed notebook. I pulled it out and threw it onto the ground. After a moment of hesitation, I scooped it back up and walked up the dark stairs to the master bedroom. It was the same as I'd left it the day before, though the vent looked off. Maybe the landlord had noticed I'd messed with it. No matter. I knelt down and pulled hard on the vent, earning a cut on my thumb as the metal slid free. I reached down and grabbed the notebook, then extended my arm into the darkness where I hit something soft and wet. I flipped on my phone's light and saw the body of a woman lying inside, covered in enough blood to leave the scent of iron in the air. I stumbled back, trying to make sense of it. Surely, I hadn't killed this woman and then driven to this house, right? Then my thought from earlier returned to me. The woman's body was almost certainly on the killer's property. The front door of the apartment below me opened with a crash. I spun and backed up, still on my hands and knees, as the sound of slow, steady footsteps climbed the stairs. The bedroom door opened, and the light flicked on. The landlord I met the other day stood in the doorway, holding an axe covered in still wet blood. "Well, I'm sad to say you weren't at home this time," he said, gripping the head of the axe with a beefy fist. "You're probably wondering what the hell's going on, am I right?" He pointed the handle of the axe toward me. "Am I right?" I nodded slowly, my mind racing. He hefted the axe in his hands. There's just something about convincing other people that they're killers. Not even the light leaving someone's eyes gives me the rush I felt when that poor sap turned himself in. "Sorry, liar, you just happened to be the next to pick up the book. But you made it easy. You even gave me your name. Looks like I'll have to leave that notebook out for someone else to find. Maybe a detective will wake up to find he's killed his wife. What do you think?" He took a step into the room. I jumped to my feet and ran for the bathroom. I knew from my time there earlier that it had a window. I'd only made it a few feet before the axe slammed into the back of my left arm. I ignored the pain and leapt at the window, crossed my arms into an X, and crashed through the glass. The fall was just long enough for me to reflect on my poor decisions before I hit the ground. A dozen things inside me broke with the impact, but that wasn't what worried me. What worried me was that I hear heavy footsteps again. But I didn't hear footsteps. I heard a cry of surprise. A young couple ran over to me. "Are you okay?" the man shouted. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was the wife calling the police. I'll skip over my stay in the hospital, the police's fruitless search for the landlord, and my panic attacks. They still haven't found him, and I don't think I'll be able to sleep until they do. I let the police take copies of the notebook, but I still own the original. And, I'm not going to lie to you, I still occasionally check the ending to make sure no new entries have shown up. The paintings in my attic change every night. My father died alone early on an August morning. I was told that they found him in the backyard, in the process of chopping down a small elm tree. A heart attack. The woman who called me from the hospital was gentle, even compassionate. I guess she figured the news would upset me. She seemed surprised when I sighed and asked if there was anything I needed to do. I didn't realize that my dad had me listed as his emergency contact. It didn't seem fair that I didn't have a say in the matter. I received another unexpected call a few days later. This time it was from Dad's lawyer. It turned out my father left me his house, 6 acres in the country, and nearly $250,000. The man who used to punish me if I got a C on my report card left me all of his worldly possessions. I guess I was all he had. Can I say no? I asked the lawyer. Of course. But you should see the house first. And the art collection. At the very least, you can sell everything and be done with it, if that's what you want to do. So, I visited the home my father left me. Inside the house was an attic, and inside the attic was a collection of paintings. There were watercolors and oils and acrylics. Portraits of kings and carpenters and old women with folded hands. Landscapes, vivid forests in bright oil so real you almost hear the birds. My favorite painting was of a girl by the ocean. Her hair was like sunshine, and her white dress tangled with the wind. She faced away from the artist towards the water. There was only one painting I avoided. It stood in the corner of the room on a white easel, covered with a black cloth. I only looked under the covering once. It was a portrait of my father, but more terrible than he ever been in life. The thing in the painting resembled my father in the same way a drowned corpse resembles the life that once animated the body. His skin was sallow, teeth cracked, pale black veins twisting across a bare scalp. The artist must have feared my father, I could see no other reason the painter would have left the portrait with such a ravenous expression of hate. One look behind the curtain was enough for me. I left that portrait in its corner. Other than that piece of rot, though, the collection as a whole was a miracle. I spent so many rainy afternoons and cold mornings in the attic among the pictures that it was immediately obvious to me when the subjects began to move. It was subtle at first. Eyes might shift in a portrait, a tree would rustle against an acrylic breeze. The girl on the beach was turning a degree or two each day. I was terrified the first night that I heard movement from the attic. The rapid sound of tap, tap, tap and soft footsteps along the ceiling woke me up. It lasted all night, and I sat there and listened, too frozen by fear to flee the house. In the morning, after the sun was high, I crept up the stairs into the attic, armed with a flashlight and the largest knife I could find in the kitchen. Both the light and the knife fell from numb fingers when I saw that every painting had changed. This wasn't just the shifting of a scene by a few angles. It was like seeing new pictures, but each with familiar subjects. The night sounds continued regularly from then on. I wasn't so afraid after the first time, though, and greeted each new morning with a trip into the attic to see the progress of my guests, roommates. It was a long night in October when I finally saw the face of the girl in the painting. I'd gone up to the attic with a candle after dinner to check on the progress of the paintings. In my dreams, they came fully to life and joined me, or perhaps even better, allowed me to join them in their kaleidoscope worlds. The girl on the beach was facing me that night. Her hand was raised slightly, as if in greeting. Everything changed last night. The noises began just after sundown, and they were unlike any I heard before. Thudding and crashing and ripping, there was a terrible dragging noise that repeated again and again. Sometime around midnight, I think I heard a scream. Though I once again fell pinned to my bed by fear, I decided I could not wait until morning to see how the paintings had changed. I worked up the courage to climb the stairs at 3 in the morning. Once I opened the door to the attic, my eyes found a massacre. All of the beautiful paintings were torn as if by animals. The canvas hung in wet tatters, frames were smashed, and everywhere, violence. Only the painting of the girl on the beach was undamaged. But to my horror, it was changed. The girl lay dead on the red-stained sand, her eyes blank and throat ripped open. I heard a brittle creak from the corner of the room. It took me a moment to realize that it was laughter, and it came from behind the black curtain that covered my father's portrait. God abandoned my town. My grandmother used to take me to church every Sunday, and I grew up a devout, God-fearing Christian. Now, I find this stuff that used to teach me a load of nonsense. If God was real, he hightailed it far away from his creations when he realized how messed up it was. I felt more that way the closer we got to the 2-year anniversary of the murder of Harris Briggs. A good kid who was always polite when I ran into him with his mama Mabel at the store. She and I went way back when we became friends in 5th period chemistry back in high school. It was a damn shame how this town treated Mabel back then and how they ignored her now. I don't care what you think of a person. I believe mothers shouldn't bury their children. How the boy named Harris Briggs died shocked the town of Coleman. His 10-year-old body was spotted alongside a dirt road 3 miles outside of town by a farmer working a field. His legs were broken, and there had been markings along his throat from where it looked as if someone had strangled him. The coroner remarked that an unknown object had sodomized him before they ran him over with a large truck and then strangled the boy to end his life. It showed savagery that made the residents uncomfortable, but that passed. The police investigated and came up empty-handed with no suspects. Many of us speculated that they did not give it their best effort because of Harris's skin color. Mabel visited the sheriff's office every day for 1.5 years. It did not matter how many hours she worked, Mabel always took the time to stop in the office. She always asked for an update on her son's case, which the deputies promised they were working on. Mabel never believed the dense, good old boys that Sheriff Watts always picked for deputies. She was right in her distrust for the boys in blue. I could often hear them complain to each other and talk about Mabel. They often said rude things in my earshot while drinking at the local bar. "That stupid black woman came in again today," the deputies often said. Even Sheriff Watts, who I had the pleasure of being neighbors with, tried to urge me to talk to Mabel. He asked me to get her to cool her heels and let his office do its job. That was until 2 weeks ago when his office announced that they were adding the Harris-Briggs file to the unsolved case files. Mabel was furious, and it disgusted even me that Sheriff Watts announced it. 2 weeks before the anniversary of her son's murder, they were giving up solving it, placing his file where they stored the investigations of unknown cow tippers and vandals who defaced the local high school. It was outright cruel in my book. My grandmother taught me one thing, though: when someone you care for is in pain, bring them something to eat. That way, they don't have to fret about cooking food themselves. I'm not much of a chef, but I prepared a nice casserole and reheatable pork chops for Mabel because tomorrow will mark the day that Harris died. I packed the food in my car and prepared to drive into town toward Mabel's house. As I entered my truck, I looked across the road to see Sheriff Watts raking the dead leaves from his yard. We waved at one another, and I left. I drove into town. The town residents were out and around, preparing for the upcoming holidays. Not a single one could give a damn about Mabel and Harris-Briggs. When I pulled into Mabel's gravel driveway, I noticed a man I had never seen before walk out of her front door. He was an average-looking man, with thin lips and black pupils in his almond-shaped eyes. The thing that struck my attention was how neatly dressed he was. The man wore a dark gray suit with a black tie. His hair was slicked back with what I assumed to be pomade. He passed by my truck and gave a nod before walking on foot toward the street. I looked back to Mabel's porch where she stood with a look of worry on her face when I exited the truck. "I will assume he ain't from around here," I joked. "No one in Coleman has a suit that nice except the shady lawyers." "Don't pay him any mind, Carr," Mabel remarked. "We had a business arrangement to settle." "Well, I will mind my business," I responded. "Just dropping by to bring food to you." "Is it that god-awful casserole you always make?" Mabel joked as she stepped off from her porch and gave me a hug. I couldn't help but grin at her calling me out for my grandmother's lousy recipe, which I ignored the instructions for when I made it. She shook her head when I pulled the pan out of the truck to hand her. "I promise you it's better this time," I laughed. "You want to come in the house?" "Sure." Mabel always kept a tight and clean house, even though she was now living alone. I sat in her living room and looked toward the wall to see the last picture of her son before his murder. He looked happy with a wide smile across his face. Mabel brought a can of beer and set it on the coffee table. I'm never a man to turn away a good drink even before 3 p.m. I popped the can. It was when I noticed that Mabel had a gauze wrapped around her hand and there appeared to be fresh blood dripping from it. "What happened to your hand?" I asked. "Just an accident in the kitchen before you got here," Mabel replied. "Wasn't paying attention while cutting tomatoes." "Looks nasty," I said. "It's fine. Just needs to heal." We visited for a while as we finished our beers. The two of us caught up with each other, keeping the topics light. I wanted to show Mabel that somebody in this town gave a damn about her, and that I was there if she ever needed someone. Mabel still looked worried, but she covered it well with her chatting. When I headed out the door, she gave me a stern stare. "Carr, you were always a decent man," Mabel called out. "Thanks." Mabel walked down her porch closer. "I need you to promise me something." "What's that?" "When you go home tonight, don't leave your house when it turns dark," Mabel replied. Just stay inside no matter what happens." "What is going on, Mabel?" "Just promise me, Carr," Mabel begged. I stopped and looked at Mabel. She had a concerned look. "Fine, I will not leave my house." I started my truck while looking at Mabel, nodded farewell, and headed back home. The sun set on Coleman around 5 as I sat back in my recliner watching college basketball. Mabel asking for me to stay inside after dark remains in my head as I sip my beer. I drink 2 more beers before the game finishes with the Wildcats winning. I've always loathed the state of Kentucky. My grandmother always said the only thing that came from Kentucky worth a damn was bourbon, and even then, no one below their state line should drink it. My stomach grumbles to the realization I had not had food today. Even when preparing my casserole and pork chops for Mabel, I had cooked nothing for myself. It limits my supper choices. I have little in the kitchen, and my culinary skills are lacking. My phone rings in the living room as I walk back to answer it. The other end is Deputy Shelby, the most thick of the bunch that Sheriff Watts hired. "Carr, can you go fetch the sheriff for me?" Shelby asks. "Come fetch him yourself," I snarled. "Or call his house because he is eating supper." Shelby breathed. "We've been trying, Carr, he ain't answering, and it's an emergency." "Let me guess," I snorted. "Otis escaped the Mayberry PD. Now he's running amok on the town square." "Becky found Jim dead in his shed," Shelby yelled over the phone. "That explains the emergency, a deputy lying dead in his shed." I did not care much for Jim. He was the rudest of the boys in blue. Jim was a well-known racist, and off-duty, he drove his lifted pickup truck around the town with the stars and bars flying. The people of Coleman would not blink an eye at a deputy flying a Confederate flag on his personal time. "What happened to Jim?" I inquired. "Someone snuck in when he was welding and took a flame to his face." Jesus. 3 loud shots interrupted my thought. It echoed across the road and field that separated my house from the residence of Sheriff Watts. The sound of a shotgun blasting. 3 loud shots interrupted my thought while blasts echoed across the road and field that separated my house from his residence. The sound of a shotgun blasting. "Shelby, send someone over to the sheriff's house. There is gunfire." I rushed out of my house and went to my truck to retrieve my rifle and the 2 bullets I could muster. My ears picked up a few more blasts of the shotgun from my yard. When I ran to the house, I noticed from the windows that someone had ransacked his living room. His television was still on, showing highlights of the scores from various games of the day. The door to the front of his house was locked. My stomach was in knots, and I ran to the back door, seeing the remnants of wood pieces on the floor. I stepped in the house. The walls riddled with holes and shotgun shells lying on the light blue carpet meant that Sheriff Watts put up a fight. The large dark red stains on the carpet further proved that point. "Sheriff, you in here?" I yelled. The only sound in the house was his television replaying the highlights of the Kentucky game and my soft footsteps walking around the den. I looked around to see no sign of the sheriff while I glanced toward the hallway. The hallway had a streak of blood along the walls that led to the back bedroom. My legs shook and my hands trembled as I grasped my rifle. "Watts, it's me, Carr," I yelled again. The trail of blood ended outside the bedroom door. Someone left it cracked open as I took a deep breath before I stepped in. The amount of blood staining the bottom of the carpet outside of it was unsettling. I rested my finger on the trigger of the rifle and stepped inside. It was sickening. The head of Sheriff Watts lay bare on top of a mountain of ripped flesh in a corner. His intestines circled around the room, with severed limbs lying around a bed covered in a pond of blood. The walls stained with splatters of his blood meant that this was personal for whoever had dismembered the town sheriff. I could feel the vomit rise in the back of my throat as I exited the room, adding another stain to the light blue carpet. The sirens in the distance meant that moron Shelby had contacted someone to tell them something horrible was happening on my road. The sound of breaking branches came from somewhere outside. Someone else was still here and close by. The siren was approaching and getting closer as I walked to the backyard. There was a dim motion light pointing at the woods as I raised my rifle. The sound of branches cracking as heavy footsteps approached. My arms went limp from terror because the footsteps didn't sound like anything I have ever heard before. That is when it showed itself. The glow of its red eyes and the texture of its skin, a deep gray color covered in loose skin, approached me. It stood up straight, dwarfing me in height. It breathed heavily from the slits where a nose should be. Its mouth was covered in yellow sharp teeth with little drops of blood pouring from its lips. It had antlers that reminded me of a grown buck, with jagged edges also covered in blood. It stared at me as it approached and stood in front of me. Any last bit of bravery I had left after coming outside like an idiot had vanished. It left me helpless, staring at it. "Car, get down!" I heard a familiar voice scream. My eardrums felt as if they would burst from the shots of Shelby's pistol. The bullets pierced the creature's skin, and it did not even flinch. Shelby stood frozen as it walked toward him, grabbing him by the throat to lift him into the air. The poor deputy kicked his legs and screamed in pain as I picked up my gun to help. I felt a hand grab my shoulder, startling me as I swung the rifle behind me. It was a man standing behind casually. He wagged his fingers in displeasure. The man in the gray suit pushed my rifle down to the ground and pointed back to the creature and Shelby. "I made a deal," he said, "and I plan to honor it. That thing will kill him." I screamed. "Do you want to join him?" he taunted. The creature let out a thunderous roar and plunged its hands into Deputy Shelby. The sound of his tearing flesh made me vomit again. It tore his insides out, scooping them out by the handful. The creature dropped the mutilated body to the ground and turned to the two of us. It froze me in place, watching the creature. The man walked toward Shelby's corpse, studying it and picking up some of his dismembered body. "Our business is complete," he muttered. The creature looked at me one last time as I tried to hold my bladder. It didn't seem threatening as it gazed at me with its red demonic eyes. The man in the black tie walked to the woods and waved his hand for the creature to join him. It turned and followed him. That is when I noticed it and realized what the hell it was. I spotted a stretched, blood-stained gauze wrapped around one of the creature's hands. It was the same as Mabel's. My weak legs finally gave out as I was on the cold ground on my knees. I could do nothing but helplessly watch as the man and Mabel disappeared into the darkness of the woods. That is when I knew it for sure. If God existed, he abandoned the town of Coleman. Something twisted my brother's head clean off. I found out what it was. I wasn't the one who found Maddie. It was his wife, Elizabeth, back from a night shift at the hospital, eager to shed her scrubs and settle in for a long sleep. Instead, she walked into the bedroom to find Maddie sitting in a chair, his severed head in his lap. I would have preferred not to hear any further details about my brother's body, but when Elizabeth called me on the phone, hysterical, she couldn't help but overshare. Dark bruises covered his arms and legs. There was blood everywhere, soaking through his white t-shirt and striped pajama pants, pooling all around the wicker chair where he sat. The skin of his neck was frayed where it had been ripped apart, almost like a popped balloon. The muscle, too, was stretched and torn, and the vertebrae stuck out from the top of his neck hole like a white, sleeping worm. Though we hadn't spoken much in the last few years, I was the only family Maddie had left. I caught the next flight to Boston and met up with Elizabeth at her parents' house. She started screaming as soon as she saw me. Or maybe she'd been screaming all day. Maybe I looked too much like my brother for her to handle. After a few hours, she calmed down enough to start saying a few words. I asked her if Manny had been in any kind of trouble. He'd been reckless in his late teens and early 20s, selling substances on campus. It was small-time stuff, but he made a few bad enemies, guys who put a real scare into him one night, prompting him to get out of the game altogether. There was nothing like that, she said. He's totally clean. Got a good job clearing out old houses. Like, when someone dies, he gets all the junk out, gets it sorted, helps separate the junk from the antiques, and takes a commission of the sales. Does he skim? I asked. Maybe someone felt cheated? She shook her head. He buys the stuff he likes, but it's always a fair price. Everybody loved him. Everybody. The cops investigated, of course, but there were no leads. No evidence of a break-in. No one with a grudge. It was like Manny had twisted his own head off and set it in his lap. One of the detectives mentioned that more than half of murders go unsolved. It seemed this would be one of them. Weeks passed, and I stuck around, trying to help Elizabeth put her life back together. Even after the police were done scouring her place, she refused to go back in. We hired some people to clean up the blood, but they told me there was only so much they could do. The hardwood in the bedroom would never give up that stain. Finally, it fell on me to go into the place and gather a few of Elizabeth's things. They were going to put it up for sale. She was still in pieces, planning to move back in with her parents, probably permanently. I rented a truck and some basic tools and told her I'd get to work. Up until that point, I'd been staying in a cheap Airbnb nearby, but with Manny's house reopened, I figured I could spend a few nights there while I packed up. When I mentioned the idea, Elizabeth gave me a weird look. You shouldn't stay there, she said. Why not? I asked, but she couldn't come up with a good reason. Of course, the day I got into the place, the first thing I did was head to the bedroom. I guess I just had to see it. The cleaners had clearly scrubbed the hell out of the place, but there was still a nasty stain in the center of the room. The mark was roughly circular and maybe 3 feet across, mostly gray but growing darker at the edges, almost black. Before she sold the house, Elizabeth would have to have the boards replaced, maybe put in carpeting. Something. For a few seconds, I just stood there, looking at the black circle, imagining my brother inside it, permanently. Once I'd spent a few moments staring, I looked up from the stain, really taking the place in for the first time. Elizabeth hadn't been kidding about the antiques. All over the apartment were old hutches and paintings of ships at sea, sets of china, and cigar store Indians. My brother had always had an eye for quality. The thing that really stuck with me, though, was a wood carving of an owl standing right in the corner of their old bedroom. The thing was larger than life, coming all the way up to my shoulder, carved out of a single trunk of elm. It was one solid piece, save for a single amber and made of glass inlay. The other eye hole was empty, giving the odd impression that the carving was winking at you. The wood had been lacquered maybe a dozen times, leaving it with an uneven plastic sheen. Deep cracks ran through one of the wings and the neck, and the base was discolored from water damage. It certainly didn't look lifelike. Yet, somehow, it felt oddly alive. All afternoon as I packed boxes of Elizabeth's clothes and shoes, the eye followed me. I'm usually not the kind of guy to get spooked by anything, but I guess after everything that had happened to Maddie, I got kind of on edge. Eventually, I threw an old towel over the carving's head, covering the eye. It felt a little stupid, but it made me feel a little better. A few hours went by, a bunch of boxes got packed, and it started to get dark. My first instinct was to sleep in the living room, away from the stain. And, honestly, away from the owl. I turned off the lights and stretched out on the couch, but it was old and lumpy, impossible to get comfortable. Maddie's mattress, practically brand new, lay untouched in the other room. Finally, after maybe an hour of rolling around, my back aching from the day of hard labor, I grabbed the blanket and headed for Maddie's old room, carefully walking around the black circle. As I tossed the blanket on the bed, I looked in the corner of the room at the owl carving. The towel I'd tossed over its head lay on the ground now. I wondered how it had fallen off. Maybe I'd been careless when I covered the statue in the first place. The eye caught the moonlight, watching. As stupid as it made me feel, I got up and walked over, picking the towel off the floor. As I did, I heard a distinct sound, something like a rat's feet skittering inside the owl. I jumped back halfway to the bed, still holding the towel in my hand. For a moment, I stared at the carving, daring it to move, waiting for another sound. Nothing. The whole time, though, even as I was watching it, the amber eye watched me. Slowly, I walked back to the carving and threw the towel over it. Then, I backed across the room to the bed, not quite realizing I was stepping through the black circle on the floor. Finally, I collapsed onto the mattress, curled under the blanket, and fell asleep. I woke to a cracking sound. At first, everything was still. Then, through the moonlit near dark of the room, I watched as the owl statue began to move. First, its left wing pushed out from inside. Then its right. The wood pushed out, perhaps 5 inches, revealing something black and skeletal inside. It looked almost like the Transformers Maddie and I had played with as kids, unseen robots pushing out through the plastic panels of a vehicle to reveal their hidden, shiny bones. I lay transfixed as 2 thin, black legs pushed out hidden panels near the owl's base. The black legs, at least, they seemed like legs, couldn't have been much wider than a curtain rod. They pushed all the way down to the floor. Then, the whole carving began to move toward me. The wood swayed on some unseen thing inside it, some too thin creature wearing the wooden owl-like armor. I looked for a way out. I could have jumped through the window, but I was on the 2nd floor. And the thing was moving too fast now anyway. As it reached the bed, it reached out, its thin, black arms growing impossibly long, its hands flattening and growing wide like dinner plates. Then it placed them over my ears and everything went black. I woke to find myself sitting on a wooden chair from the kitchen. The owl must have brought it in while I was passed out. It had placed me inside the black circle. I thought of Maddie, sitting here just like me, not that long ago. I tried to move, but the long black rods that I'd assumed were the owl's legs bound my ankles to the chair. Its hands still gripped my head, their grip only slightly more relaxed than when it had first grasped me. The carving itself stood only a few inches in front of me. Though it fixed me with its amber eye, I could see now that the other eye hole was open, revealing something black and moving inside. "What are you?" I asked, barely able to speak. I think it laughed. At least, it sounded a little like a laugh. "I'm not quite an owl," it said. Its voice was low, echoing out through the cracks in the owl's wooden shell. "I'm not quite a person either. Some days I feel closer to bird, some days closer to man. But actually, I've been around long before owls ever flew. Of course," it continued, "owls are generally far less interesting than humans. They're basic creatures. Give them a moonlit night and a field full of frightened mice, and they'll be happy. So happy. Every single time. For humans, nothing is ever enough." It clicked its tongue, then got quiet. "But there is one area in which owls truly excel, which I have always admired," it said. "They are fantastic at turning their heads. So much better than humans. It's an area where it's not even a competition, not even close." As it said this, I felt the pressure from its plate-like hands increase against my temples, and it turned my neck about 90 degrees to the right, not enough to hurt exactly, but it was certainly uncomfortable. I thought of Matty, his head twisted clean off and set carefully in his lap. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "Because, as I said, humans are interesting, but also frustrating. Not to belabor the comparison to owls, but truly, your eyesight is quite poor. And not just your night vision. Your ability to see yourselves is quite abysmal. Watching you with only one eye, I can see truths about you that you simply cannot face." "What the heck are you talking about?" I screamed. It held a black finger to its beak, shushing me. "Please," it said. "If you must scream, wait until you really, really must. Later in the game, it may be unavoidable." "Game?" I whispered. "It's one of my own invention, though it's not too different than some human games. A little bit truth or dare. A little bit mercy. Mostly mercy. The rules aren't complicated. I'll be telling you some truths about your life. Unpleasant truths. Each truth will come with a bit of pain, both mental and physical. When you've had enough, simply speak the word mercy, and your pain will be over. And my head will be in my lap," I said. "Very good," it said. "I knew you were a smart one. In that case, it sounds like no further explanation will be needed. Except that I should add, the result of this exercise will be inevitable. You will eventually beg for mercy. Out of compassion, I'll go ahead and offer you an opportunity to ask for it right now, just to spare yourself the pain ahead." For a moment, I considered the offer. It would be easy to let it simply do what it wanted, to give my head one great, final twist. That would be it. Nothing would hurt after that. But something in me wasn't ready to let go. "No," I said. "Not yet." Deep from within the owl's wooden head, the dark thing looked out at me. Then, it seemed to nod. I felt its impossibly strong hands tighten around my head and began to turn it, perhaps 10 more degrees to the right. It was definitely past the point of uncomfortable now. Along with this physical pain, I'll be stating a truth that carries a similar amount of mental anguish, said the dark, thin thing. I would like to start by saying that you were never a good brother. As a boy, you were the golden child, taking all of your mother's love, allowing a narrative to develop that your brother was the eternal screw-up. Though you pretended to be kind to him, secretly, deep down you were happy to play the role of the favored son. Sometimes, it even made you happy to hear your mother ranting at him, refusing him meals as he cried in his room, knowing that his misdeeds only made you look all the better. "No," I said, trying to wriggle my neck free. "Is that what Matty said?" I was a good brother. After Mom used to tear into him, I'd go to his room, bring him snacks when she threw his dinner in the trash. I took care of him. The thing's hands tightened around my head, turning it ever farther. "That happened once or twice," said the thing. "It was little comfort to your brother. More often than not, he went to sleep hungry, well aware that no one loved him, least of all you." I wanted to say more, but I knew it would only bring pain. I held my tongue. "Even in adulthood, you let your brother flounder," it said. "It would have been so easy to help him out with a few $1,000s. You knew he was destitute, selling substances to make ends meet. He would have blown that money in a week," I said. "Might have gone on a bender, gotten himself killed." "No," it shouted, growing angry at me now. "You were selfish. You wanted to see him twist in the wind. You wanted to be superior." It twisted my neck 5 more degrees. I could feel the skin growing tight as it twisted, the muscles beneath straining against the black hands. "Why are you even here?" it asked. "You never visited when he was alive. Perhaps it actually frustrated you to see him getting his life together. Or is it Elizabeth? You always felt she was too good for Matty. But you always secretly had a little crush, didn't you? Maybe now that he's dead. No, I said, and hot tears were starting to roll down my face. I was just trying to be a good brother. I swear. Too late, the thing shouted. Too late. It twisted my head again. I felt a wetness on my skin and wondered if I had begun to bleed. Mercy, the thing shouted. Simply say the word and this will all be over. Your brother suffered far less. I'm sorry, Manny, I said, just talking into the dark. I'm sorry, I did my best. I really did love you, always. Mercy, shouted the thing. Just keep going, I said. It'll be over soon enough. But I'll never ask for it. Never. As I said the words, the first rays of sun cut through the drawn shades. Where the rays struck the thing's hands, there was a smoky smell. Mercy, quick, or it'll only hurt worse, shouted the thing, but there was a note of fear in its tone now. Go ahead then, I said. But it didn't. The sun shone more brightly. Slowly, the pressure on my temples began to ease. The black limbs withdrew. The owl began to back away into its corner. By the time dawn had fully flooded the room, the carving was back in place. That morning, I returned to Elizabeth's parents' house with a few boxes of her things. I must have looked pretty wrecked because she asked how I was doing, a note of concern in her voice. I'm okay, I said. But I can't stay here anymore. I've got to get home. She nodded, understanding. I've been thinking about it, she said. And I think I can handle the rest. I've been leaning on you too hard. Suddenly, a wave of panic flooded through me. Promise you won't stay there, I said. Promise. I would never, she said. Even when Maddie was alive, I didn't like sleeping there. All those old antiques. I never liked the smell. But Maddie loved them, so. Thank you, I said, trying to stay composed. For being so good to him. She reached out and gave me a big hug. I know you two hadn't hung out much over the last few years, but Maddie always said you were there when he needed him, she said. Now I see what he meant. She looked over at my rental truck. There, in the bed, lay the wooden owl. Is that one of Maddie's? She asked. I was hoping you'd let me have it, I said. One last thing to remember him by. She shrugged. I've never seen it before. Maybe he'd just gotten it. Yeah, I said. Could be. I said goodbye and got in the truck. And then I drove. I headed out of the city, out where the urban sprawl gave way to some kind of forest, marked with a few sunny meadows. When I was satisfied that I'd reached the middle of nowhere, I stopped. I took the statue from the bed of the truck and dragged it out into a sunny field. All the while, I heard the skittering sound inside. It was getting hot, toward afternoon, and I could tell the heat and light were affecting the thing inside. I knew the wood was full of little cracks. Some of them must have been big enough to let the light through. It's still only noon, I said. Not quite the hottest part of the day. That'll be hours from now, maybe at 3 or 4. I wonder if you'll make it that far. A small shriek emerged from inside the owl. I ignored it. Now, over in the truck, I've got a saw, I continued. I could cut this owl shell of yours right in half and let the light take you. And I will. But first, I'm going to need you to ask for mercy. I had just finished an evening shift, and I enjoyed the walk home under a magnificent, almost full moon that dimly illuminated my path ahead. In my hand, I held a bottle of Bordeaux, excited for dinner prepared by my wife, Sarah. She'd already left me a text saying she'd almost finished up, and that my dog eagerly awaited my arrival, tapping around on the floor in our home, wondering what took me so long. The road home took me past a riding school, with about a dozen horses spending their night in the adjacent, fenced-in field. I frequently stopped by to feed them a snack, carrots or apples mostly, and as such, we'd formed a sort of friendship. But something seemed off that evening. Usually, the curious creatures would come trotting over, ecstatic if they noticed me carrying food, but instead of their neighing greetings, they ignored me, their eyes transfixed by the bright moon above. I tried the usual clicking sound to attract their attention, but they didn't even take note of my presence. After a moment of staring up at the sky, in a futile attempt at figuring out what they found so interesting, I gave up and continued home. My dog, Hugo, a massive Labrador who still acted as a lap dog, excitedly jumped up to greet me as I walked in through the door. He almost knocked me to the ground, barely allowing me to save the bottle of wine I held. Sarah quickly came to my aid, hopelessly trying to pull him off, an almost impossible feat once Hugo had entered his aggressive cuddle mode. But after a few wet licks and some paw marks on my off-white shirt, he calmed down thanks to the temptation of a promised dog snack if he behaved. "The horses were acting weird tonight," I said with a mouthful of pork chop. "What do you mean, weird?" Sarah asked. "They completely ignored me, just stared up at the moon." She gave me a concerned look before glancing over at Hugo. "That's odd. Same thing happened as I took the dog out for some fresh air, just before you got back home. He wouldn't stop staring up at the sky. I had to drag him back with me." "Well, that's different. Hugo is clearly an idiot," I said as I gestured to our dog, lying with his snout half submerged in his water bowl, producing bubbles with each breath. Sarah giggled, and we went about our dinner, doing our best to just enjoy our weekly date night with wine, dinner, and a boring movie. The next evening following work, I once again passed by the riding school, this time making sure I carried with me a bag of irresistible goods for the majestic horses. I figured they'd been sulky last night since I passed without a worthy offer. Yet, they still stared up at the moon. I stood by their fence for a few minutes, clicking at them, holding out tasty carrots, even throwing some at their feet. They just kept staring, their attention locked on the shiny celestial body above us. Eventually, it started to get cold, and I headed back home. As I arrived, I found Hugo standing in our garden, his eyes fixed on the sky, with Sarah desperately trying to drag him inside, all the while spouting profanities at our massive idiot, but he refused to budge. "Sarah, what's going on?" "This dumbass won't come back inside," she panted as she pulled at his leash with all of her force. I bent down to pet Hugo, hoping some love would convince him to move his chubby behind. He growled at me as I reached out my hand. Shocked at his sudden change in attitude, I bent down to try again, but instead of his cuddly self, he bit me. Hugo bit me. Though it wasn't a particularly hard bite, one that didn't even break the skin, it was still the first time he'd shown any sort of aggressive behavior towards us, or anyone for that matter. He'd always been a peaceful, if not a bit docile, creature. In anger, I grabbed his collar and started dragging him back inside the house. All the while, he barked and growled in defiance. We put him into his travel cage for the night and locked the door so he could lay there and think about what he'd done. We went to bed angry, discussing what to do about Hugo's sudden outburst. Call a veterinarian, enroll him in classes, or just take it as a one-time event. He'd always been the most loving being, so something was most definitely off. Then, as we awoke in the morning, ready to give our dumb dog another chance, we found him lying still in his cage. He always, without fail, jumped up once he heard our footsteps approaching him in the morning, but on that particular day, he just lay there. "Hey boy, wake up," I said as I opened the door, but he still wouldn't move. It didn't take long for the realization to hit me. Hugo was dead. He passed at some point during the night, only 7 years of age. We cried as we embraced his limp body in our arms. He'd been a large dog, but he had never felt that heavy, reduced to a furry bag of meat with no personality inside. I called in sick to work, but my wife didn't get the chance as they were understaffed. After she unwillingly left, I took the time to bury Hugo in the garden, telling him I forgave him for biting me, that he was the best dog anyone could ever have, that I loved him. Following the burial, at 10 a.m., I cracked open a beer and decided to watch some television. Any distraction was a welcome gift. I flipped through the channels filled with daytime crap until I stumbled upon a local news segment regarding the riding school, the very same I passed every day to and from work. During the night, all of their 16 horses had fallen over dead, and just like with Hugo, there was no apparent cause. It was like they just stopped living out of sheer willpower. I knew it had to be related and feared the horses might have died from some sort of infection. Maybe one that I carried with me home and transferred to Hugo. Feeling more than a bit guilty, and with limited medical knowledge, I called the veterinarian, half sobbing as I asked if I'd somehow killed my own dog. The woman on the other end of the line sounded tired, exhausted from an overnight shift, and explained that no disease would carry over from equines to canines with a healthy human as the carrier. She continued to say that it was a citywide situation, with pets and local wildlife falling over dead, and no one could fathom why. Due to this, the city was about to order all pets to be kept inside while they could assess the situation, but for us, it was all too late. Sarah came home in the evening from an overtime shift. Apparently, quite a few of her coworkers hadn't turned up for work, even without calling in sick, and she had to stay behind to pick up the slack. She brought flowers for Hugo's grave, and while she took a few moments to say goodbye, I cooked up some dinner, hoping to brighten the mood ever so slightly. As the pasta reached the perfect al dente consistency and the sauce simmered in the pan, I realized that Sarah still hadn't come back in. I walked out into the garden to find Sarah at Hugo's grave, but she wasn't there to say farewell. She simply stared up at the moon, unmoving, not caring about what was happening around her. "Sarah, what are you doing?" I asked, concerned. She didn't respond. "Sarah, come on," I said, my voice getting louder as I walked over to her. Still no response. I grabbed her shoulder, which caused her to violently flinch in shock, as if I'd snuck up behind to scare her. She seemed frazzled, but at least it got her attention. "Oh, shoot, I'm sorry. I kind of spaced out there for a second. Is dinner ready?" "Yeah." "What were you looking at, Sarah?" "What do you mean?" "You were staring up at the sky, just like Hugo," I said calmly, as I realized how stressed out she seemed. No, I just zoned out." I. She trailed off. "It's all right, Sarah, let's just eat." We finished dinner in silence and went to bed without discussing Hugo nor what had happened to my wife. Something about her felt different, broken, but I couldn't decide whether she'd seen something in the sky or if she was just distraught from the loss of her dog. I twisted and turned in bed that night, unable to rest, drifting in and out of consciousness, a dreamless sleep filled with nothing but worry. At some point, I reached out my arm and realized Sarah's part of the bed was vacant. A realization that quickly jolted me awake. After running through the house, calling out for her, I caught a glimpse of someone standing out in the garden, staring up at the sky. "Sarah, what on earth are you doing?" I yelled as I ran over to her, ready to drag her back inside, but before I could even reach her, she collapsed to the ground. "Sarah." I ran over to check on her, and though she was still alive, I couldn't get her to regain consciousness. Without further hesitation, and with trembling hands, I called 911, impatiently awaiting a response. It rang for a full minute, and there was no one on the other end to respond to my call. 2 minutes, then 3, and at the 4th minute of waiting without an answer, I hung up, deciding I would drive her to the hospital on my own. I sped through our little town, noticing a few passed out people lying on the side of the street, all in various states of undress. Nightgowns, naked, fully clothed, whatever the situation, something was terribly wrong. As we arrived at the hospital and pulled into the drop-off meant for ambulances, I was shaken by the oddly silent atmosphere surrounding the area. Only a single doctor came out to assess the situation. "Where is everyone?" I asked as I carried my unconscious wife out of the car. The doctor looked stressed, but not surprised, clearly overwhelmed by whatever had been happening during the night. He quickly looked over my wife, checking for any signs of consciousness. "Come on," he finally said, "let's get her inside." The hospital seemed void of any staff, only operated by a minute skeleton crew, but despite the scanty help, the lobby itself had been filled to the brim with hospital beds, stretchers, and wheelchairs, all occupied by other, unconscious people. "What's happening here?" I asked as we struggled to find a free bed. We don't know. Half the staff simply didn't show up for work, and the rest are acting strangely, refusing to stop staring up at the moon. It doesn't make any sense." He pointed to a few nurses and doctors running from patient to patient, desperately trying to figure out what ailed them. "This is all we have left," he said. "My wife, will she be all right?" I asked. The doctor didn't answer. It was beyond what any of them had ever dealt with, and it clearly showed. Our town had been ravaged by an impossible, senseless disease with an unknown cause. I sat with my wife for hours, and by some stroke of luck, we managed to find her a room occupied by only 5 other patients, all apparently suffering from the same condition, none awakening from their forced slumber. After a while, I decided to get some fresh air. I needed to think, to come up with a solution, and at almost 3 in the morning, I ventured outside for a cigarette, a habit I'd quit years earlier. But desperate times called for desperate measures. On my way, one of the doctors stopped me. "Where are you going?" "Out for a smoke." "Why?" He shook his head in frustration, as tired and burned out as the others. "Just don't look at the sky, all right?" I nodded and walked outside, staring at my feet with each step. As I inhaled the toxic smoke, I felt a smidge less horrified, and after 3 cigarettes, I forgot why I ever quit. I firmly kept my eyes on the ground, the ambulances, the building, anything but the sky. Alas, in the window of the entrance, I saw the reflection of our bright lunar body, and that was all it took. I looked up at the moon. It had been the one that transfixed the animals, my wife, and probably all the other people suffering. During the past few days, I'd spent a lot of time looking up at it, wondering what kind of mysteries had driven people from their health and sanity, and then, for the first time, I noticed something different. They hadn't been staring at the moon at all, but at something beside it, something new. Next to the moon hung a massive, black sphere, only visible due to the illuminated outline created as the moonlight reflected off it. I could only barely see it, but nevertheless, there it was, growing ever so slightly with each passing minute. I should have been horrified. I should have run back into the hospital, but I couldn't. It was just too beautiful, perfectly spherical, with shades of black surrounding its ever-growing aura. It was hypnotic. I couldn't stop looking at it. Hours passed, and the moon descended below the horizon, replaced by a glowing orb of sunshine, taking the magnificent sphere with it. I only then realized that I'd stared, unblinking and unmoving at the object in the sky for the entire night, and it made me feel happy. I spent the night unwillingly staring at the moon. My wife is still unconscious, but it no longer worries me. My only priority is the incredible sphere. Whatever it is, something awakened within me when I first lay my eyes upon it, and I know in my heart when nightfall comes, I won't be strong enough to resist looking up into the sky to look for the black sphere. That's why I'm writing this now, while I'm still myself. Whatever you do, when night creeps over your home like a blanket of darkness, stay inside, don't look up at the sky. Hug your family, enjoy your life, because whatever that sphere is, it's growing in size, and it's getting closer. I was a stowaway on a cruise ship. The passengers only came out of their cabins at night. I was on the run. I don't want to say why because I don't want to incriminate myself. Though, if anyone from the authorities does read this, I could most likely enter a plea of mental disorder. No sane person would surely claim to have experienced what I did. I had been sleeping rough down by the docks, which wasn't as bad as it sounds. I had found a sheltered place, a covered lock-up bay for bicycles that no one seemed to use. I had a good sleeping bag and a sad face that worked wonders for getting change from passing strangers. All good until I noticed I was being eyeballed by the occupants of a passing patrol car. Easy come, easy go, I thought, putting my hands in my pockets and walking away as nonchalantly as I could from my spot. I didn't want to take any chances, so it was time to move on. One of the few things I can say with any certainty about my deadbeat life is that I have usually gone with the flow. The other kids were stealing cars, so I did the same. There was easy money moving substances around on behalf of the local dealer, so that became my thing. When matters escalated, when the thing I don't want to talk about happened, I was part of a crew. Bad people that I fell in with, going with the flow. I rounded a corner, and a cruise ship came into view. It looked like it had seen better days, I thought, then noticed there was a walkway from the side of the docks attached to the ship, and no one in sight. The flow took me up the walkway and onto the ship. Everywhere I looked, I saw cracked paint and stains and cobweb after cobweb. Faded bunting hung limply from railings, and water pooled in gaps in the decking. I couldn't see anyone paying to take a cruise on this ship. For my part, I've never felt guilty about taking a free ride in my life, and the only destination I cared about was away from here. I had still seen no crew but did not want to push my luck, so I hunted around for the nearest place to hide. I'll lose cover over a lifeboat later, and I was snuggled up in the dark. And just in time, as I could hear shouting, boots clattering. The flurry of noise passed. I chanced to look out from the lifeboat and saw a dozen or so wooden crates being manhandled up the walkway. I was starting to think this was a cargo vessel rather than a cruise liner. Maybe once, 20 or more years ago, it had welcomed passengers for voyages of pampered luxury. Surely not now, though. Then I heard new voices. Men talking animatedly and sounding like they were heading my way. I ducked back under cover and waited. Soon after, I felt the ship rattle beneath me, felt as much as heard it creaking and groaning, and then, with a worrying lurch, it started moving. I started to relax. I had left one lot of troubles behind, and the future was unwritten. It wasn't long, though, before my bladder ruined my sense of calm. I was bursting but did not want to go in the lifeboat as I had no idea how long I would need to hide out there, so, real cautious, real slow, I emerged onto the deck. I seemed to be alone. Relieved, I relieved myself. The deck on this part of the ship was empty apart from my lifeboat and a row of sun loungers. It had turned into a hot day, and I would have loved to have settled into one but dared not risk it. My business finished, I climbed back under the covers and got as comfortable as I could. At some point, I fell asleep. After stretching my aching limbs in the confined space of my new home and yawning, I lifted the cover a little to see if the coast was clear so I could head out and try and find something to eat and drink. It was fine, and I was soon back on deck, still alone, the only passenger, it seemed to me. A bit further down the deck, the doors to what I assumed were cabins remained closed, and it looked like the shutters on the small windows of each were down. My theory that this was now a cargo ship rather than a passenger vessel appeared more and more likely. This was reinforced when, an hour or so later, we approached a new harbor. I had no idea where we were, but the dock we pulled into was even more run down than the ship. Crouching low and glancing constantly around, I watched as more boxes were loaded. These boxes seemed to rattle and were dotted with what I thought could be air holes. Livestock containers, I assumed. Some poor beasts being transported under conditions that must have been illegal. I decided to go in search of food and something to wash it down with while, I hoped, the crew were fully occupied loading their new cargo. I got lucky, finding an unlocked storeroom with tins of corned meat and, wonders of wonders, a crate of beer. I took less than I wanted as I didn't want to make it too obvious there was a thief on board and scurried back to the lifeboat. Filling my belly with salty, rubbery meat washed down with warm beer, it started to feel like a home from home. Until the cries began. At first, I thought it was just the ship creaking, its old metal and wood protesting, but soon it became horribly clear they were the cries of living creatures. The livestock, it must have been. They almost sounded human. It was horrible. I wiped my face, feeling suddenly hot. Whether it was the hideous sounds or the warm beer and cold meat, my stomach lurched. I hurried back out onto the deck and leaned over the side of the ship where I was violently sick. I stood there gasping and shivering. Night was falling, and I watched the last of the lights slip away, thankful that the only sounds I could hear now were those of the ship and the water lapping at its hull, and then a click. I turned, saw it was one of the cabin doors opening. I swore to myself. There was no time to get back into the lifeboat, so I ducked under its prow and made myself as small as possible. A man emerged from the cabin. He wore a long black coat and moved with a slow, easy grace. He walked with a silver-handled cane, though for show rather than any need of it, I believed. Under the light of the stars and a quarter moon, his skin appeared pale. His head was shaven, with the intermingling lines of a tattoo reaching up one side of his face. I was a night security guard at a parking garage, and this is why I quit. 8 months ago, I interviewed for a position as a security guard. The location was a 24-hour parking structure in the downtown area of my city. I interviewed for a daytime position, but when I was offered the job, they asked if I could work the graveyard shift. I was not thrilled. I almost turned it down, but my bills weren't going to pay themselves, and I didn't have anything else lined up. So, I took the job. It wasn't so bad, to be honest. It was quiet most of the time, and not a lot happened, at first. My job was to show up at 10 p.m., work my shift, and go home at 6 a.m. I tend to be an antisocial person, so the lack of human interaction was actually kind of comforting. I didn't even have to interact with my supervisor most of the time. I would come to the office on the ground floor through an employee entrance, clock in at the computer, and then make my rounds. Now, movies would have you believe I get to sleep with my feet up on my desk while a bank of monitors lights the room through the night. Honestly, I wish that were the case. In reality, there were 2 screens split into 6 feeds each, all crammed together so they were basically thumbnails, 1 camera for each floor of the garage. The cameras were mounted over the elevator doors in the center of each floor. They would oscillate back and forth slowly, but they didn't actually catch very much. If I spotted something out of the ordinary on one of my feeds, it would be my job to go check it out. I barely spent any time in the actual office, though. I was encouraged to walk the floors and scope things out to feel out the space. I liked this. Plus, I got fresh air. That tiny concrete room made me feel claustrophobic. On most nights, I would walk from one floor to the next, casually looking between cars and into the occasional window to make sure nobody was attempting any break-ins. I preferred to take the stairs because it was more interesting than the elevators. Since it was late at night, there were very few cars coming in or out of the garage. The office building next door used the garage for employee parking, but only about 3 employees used it that late at night. There were a few regulars I began to recognize, and being as antisocial as I am, I only ever exchanged eye contact or a nod. The parking structure had retractable shutters at the entrance and exit. If someone wanted to park, they would drive up and press a button on a console, which produced a ticket. The shutter would open and let them in, closing behind them as they drove through. When they left, they would put the ticket into an exit console, insert payment, and the garage shutter would slide open to let them out. The regulars or long-term customers sometimes had prepaid fob cards that would open the door if scanned at the console. Super exciting, I know. There were very rarely any people walking through the garage during my shift. I would see people leave after parking and return to exit, but the rest of the night, it was quiet and still. If you were on foot, there were only 2 ways to get in or out of the garage: the exit-only steel door at the bottom of the staircase and the elevators. Every once in a long while, I would help someone jump-start their car or call a locksmith to help with keys locked inside a vehicle. Even these occurrences were rare. This seemed like the perfect job for me, weirdly enough. I would do my rounds, clock out at 6 a.m. sharp, and take the bus home. I got used to being up all night and sleeping during the day. I didn't have to deal with much. I basically just had to be there. Then, things changed. One night around 2 a.m., I heard a loud crash somewhere on the upper levels. I was walking on the 2nd or 3rd floor when I heard it. It was far up there, like at least 5 or 6 floors above me. It sounded like somebody had thrown a dumpster off the roof of a skyscraper. The noise rumbled through the emptiness of the concrete structure like a thunderclap, one tremendous crash, followed by silence. I stopped and listened for a few seconds, waiting for anything else, my heart slamming in my ears. I took the stairs up, fueled by adrenaline. At each floor, I glanced in to see if the crash came from there, then moved up to the next floor. Before I realized it, I was on the roof of the structure. Dazed, I headed back, a little slower this time. I didn't find a thing. My initial thought was a car accident, but there wasn't one. I had no choice but to file a report and move on with my life. I never found the source of the noise. A few weeks passed. Then one night, I was on my lunch break around 1 a.m. eating in the office. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement on the left side monitor. I checked the display closely. On the 6th floor, some person was running from one side of the floor to the other, then back again. It looked like an adult or possibly a teenager with long, messy black hair. It was hard to make out any other details, partly because this person was moving fast, but also because the individual feeds were pretty small. I grabbed my big mag light and ran out of the office. Again, I took the stairs. 30 seconds later, I arrived at the 6th floor. I took in my surroundings. The figure wasn't there. I walked to the other side of the floor slowly, sweeping my light as I walked. As I reached the end and turned around to head back toward the stairs, I just caught the last glimmer of light as one of the elevators at the center of the floor slid closed. I sprinted back to the stairs, knowing I could beat the elevator to the street level. I was jumping down the last 5 steps on each floor, moving fast. I opened the exit-only door and pushed my way out into the street. I waited outside the elevator for a few seconds until the door slid open. Aside from some ads for the local Target, the elevator was empty. Son of a gun, I hissed aloud. The person must have gotten off on a different floor. I jogged around to the side of the building and entered through the steel employee door. I went straight to the office to check the monitors. I saw no movement at all. It was pretty weird that somebody was running through the parking structure like that. In the end, I wrote an entry in the logbook and continued my shift. And nothing more happened. Until the next night. At about 1:30 a.m. the next night, lunch again, Maya caught something on one of the screens. I quickly hopped up and checked the feeds. The sight of him made me shiver, and I tried to retreat further back under the lifeboat. As he began to promenade along the deck, more cabin doors opened and more figures stepped out. There were about a dozen that I could see. Each was draped in black. Their pale countenances were expressionless. Some appeared to be male, some female. All their heads were shaved. A variety of intricate facial tattoos seemed to be the only distinguishing marks. Not a word was said between them as they took in the night air. I watched entranced and unsettled in equal measure. There was something otherworldly about the passengers. Something which set my nerves on edge. I would have fled if I could, but as it was, I had no choice but to cower in my hiding place and hope that none of them would spot me, even though their stroll along the decks was now taking them right past me. A new figure appeared. He was dressed in a white uniform and carried a tray holding narrow, ornate glasses filled to the brim with a dark liquid. A companion followed in his wake. Together, they began to move among the passengers, offering drinks which were eagerly taken. For all their strange appearance, the passengers had up to that point shown a degree of finesse that seemed to be cast aside as they greedily swallowed down their drinks in one, then proceeded to lick the glasses with long, slim tongues that flickered out of lips stained dark red with the liquid. The passenger closest to me smiled, a tight, controlled movement. I felt sick when I saw his teeth, saw sharp, bestial tips. I closed my eyes. Like a child hiding from something that should have remained within its imagination, I could not see anymore without losing control. Hours later, a morning that I thought would never come crept into the sky, and the deck was once more deserted. The passengers had returned to their cabins. I stayed in my hiding place and before long saw the crew carrying objects bundled inside tarpaulin onto the deck. One by one, they tossed their loads into the sea. It was the carcasses of the livestock, I thought, then glimpsed a hand and a gap in the tarpaulin shroud as it struck the gray ocean. A human hand. 10 loads in all were discarded. 10 bodies. They floated on the surface for a moment before slipping into the depths. There was no blood pooling on the surface. No sign of life. I thought of a creature that had also traveled by ship from its ancient home to English shores. Of legends and myths. I thought of the cries I had heard, and cold fear passed through my body as the truth dawned on me. I thought of sly smiles and crimson-stained lips and razor-sharp teeth, of the hell which awaited me on this ship when night once more fell. I crouched there and wept. The sun was high overhead when my chance presented itself. We were once more approaching a dock. I saw crates lined up, waiting to be brought on board. Imagine glasses brimming, ready for the passengers to drink their fill. I took my chance and clambered up onto the side of the ship, then plummeted into the water. I made it. I am sitting on a beach now, sipping a cold drink. It is a beautiful day, but I know now that there are creatures out there that care nothing for the day, that wait for the sun to dip below the horizon. I know now that when night falls, fear returns. Floor 7. A similar dark figure with no discernible features ambled into view. The person was just walking, very slowly. I watched on the 2-inch by 3-inch thumbnail as the figure shuffled directly toward the camera from a shadowy back wall. I strained at the figure on the screen, trying to make out details. Strangest thing, though, it's like they were cut out of black paper. This person appeared to be completely flat in both color and volume. For your reference, the cameras in my parking structure were mounted above and between 2 elevator doors situated at the center of each floor. They oscillate on 180 degrees axis. At their leftmost position, they show a ramp where cars descend to the next level down. At their rightmost position, they show a ramp where cars ascend to the current level from below. When the cameras point straight forward, you can see a low point and the ground inclines in both directions. When I saw this strange, featureless shadow figure moving slowly from the center toward the elevators, something felt very wrong. Every time the camera came back to the center, the figure was closer. I had to remind myself that I was on the clock. My mind tried to assemble a plausible story to explain the shadowy figure. Maybe this person was lost and needed help getting out of the structure. Maybe it was a vagrant that had gotten in through the elevators and was messing around. For a second, my memory flashed back to when I was in training. My trainer had told me that homeless people sometimes got into the structure. He told me a story about one transient in particular who would enter through the elevators and hang out in the shadowy staircases between floors. The trainer would find the guy passed out on the steps sometimes, once with a needle in his arm. I tried to convince myself that what I was looking at was a homeless guy. Somehow, in the back of my mind, I knew this was not the case. This was something else. Nevertheless, I had a job to do. I got up and headed to the 7th floor. The first thing I noticed as I approached was that there was no light shining into the stairwell. Normally, sterile fluorescent light would spill into the opening from the overhead lamps. Floor 7 was dark. I clicked my mag light on and aimed it into the parking area from the stairs. At first, nothing. A white Nissan Murano sat silently on the other end of the floor. Otherwise, there were no other vehicles. And no figure. Then, a shadowy shape stirred on the other side of the car. It was impossible to make out what it was from the stairs, but I could see something moving between the tires. I approached cautiously with my light trained on the car. I patted my pockets with my left hand and realized I had left my phone in the office. Stupid. As I got closer to the vehicle, I could hear a heavy scratching noise on the floor of the structure. It sounded like someone dragging a piece of metal across the ground slowly. I swung out wide, keeping my distance from the car so I could shine my light safely at whatever was over there. I took the last step and aimed the flashlight at the other side of the car. The light clicked off. "Oh no," I blurted out, my voice echoing through the structure. I strained to make out anything now as my eyes slowly adjusted to the dark. I could make out the basic shape of the car about 15 feet in front of me, but couldn't see any movement. The scratching sound was gone. In a panic, I smacked the back of the mag light with the palm of my hand. The bulb weakly flickered and finally stayed on. I pointed the beam of light with a shaky hand toward the shadowy spot in front of me. No one there. Not a soul. Then a sound from behind me. I pivoted in that direction to see a thing slowly approaching. It was humanoid, bipedal. The figure easily stood 7 feet tall, maybe taller, but incredibly thin. The thing had pale gray skin and was completely naked. It reached out to me desperately with impossibly long arms. I could see what looked like a pained expression on its wrinkled, eyeless face. Its mouth hung open, agog and filled with brown glistening teeth. Taut skin covered useless eye holes. A mane of long, tangled black hair spilled from the top of its head and past its shoulders in a matted, scraggly mess. Its fingers trembled as it reached for me. A deep groan escaped its cavernous mouth. I tried to run. Believe me. Adrenaline dumped into my system, and my fight or flight response engaged. In this case, without thinking, my body chose fight. I swung the maglite hard and connected solidly with its left hand. The creature let out a piercing shriek that tore through the night, echoing within the parking structure. The thing reeled back and fell over. Instead of falling prone, however, the thing arched its slender back and planted its hands and feet, running on all fours. It moved unnaturally quickly toward me. It let out another shriek, this one louder and more furious sounding. I swung the steel flashlight again, this time over my head and downward. I caught the creature square in the top of its huge head. A mist of droplets splattered on my face, but I hardly noticed. Now my flight response made its appearance. I booked it in the direction of the stairs, moving faster than I had ever moved before. My muscles tightened into knots as I grabbed the railings, skipping 5 stairs at a time. I lost my footing and tumbled down the very last section of steps leading to the exit-only door. Pain bloomed as I smashed my face into the heavy metal door. I didn't stop. I quickly rolled out of my fall and was up again in a second, running out into the quiet street. Without thinking, I dashed across the street to the bus stop and panted there with my hands on my knees. I struggled to catch my breath. After long consideration and trying to process what had happened and what I had seen, I decided to wait until sunrise to re-enter the structure. Around 5:30 a.m., I reluctantly entered through the employee door to the security room. I scribbled a note in the logbook, grabbed my stuff, and left. That's the last time I ever went near that cursed parking garage. And so it goes. I don't know what I saw, and frankly, I don't want to know. I received several calls from my supervisor over the next few days, but I ignored them. After a while, the calls stopped. I am sure they will find a suitable replacement for me. I will be seeking employment elsewhere. I did learn something from all of this. Some stones are best left unturned. I babysit for a family with a sweet 6-year-old girl named Susie, who's usually excited for bedtime. We play, watch a bit of TV, then I tuck her in and read a story. She's always been good about it, never fussing when it's time to sleep. But lately, she's been different, less cheerful, even reluctant when I say it's bedtime. I asked if she was feeling okay, and she said she didn't like bedtime anymore. One night, as I tucked her in, she asked for a story about monsters that looked like people, ones you couldn't tell were monsters. I was thrown off, not sure what to say, so I read her a fairy tale instead. This continued for weeks, with Susie still not liking bedtime. I reassured her that nothing would hurt her and that I was looking after her, but one night, she told me, "I know I'm not alone." Her tone was unsettling, as if I was the one being silly. Then, one evening, after I tucked Susie in, I fell asleep on the sofa. The lights were off, and the TV flickered low. Suddenly, I felt a gentle shake on my arm, waking me. In the dim light, I saw the silhouette of Susie standing in front of me, breathing hard as if she'd been running. I comforted her, asking, "What's the matter, sweetheart?" But she didn't answer. She just stood there, frozen, eyes wide and fearful. Then, I saw her, Susie, standing in the doorway, watching us with those sad, haunted eyes. "That's why I don't like bedtime," she whispered. "I see her too,"